The background to the project is the publication of the Division of Clinical Psychology's position statement on classification, which was released at the same time, in 2013, as the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM.
And in essence, what this statement said was that we think it's time to move on from the diagnostic disease model of distress. So that was our inspiration, if you like, as a group of us who decided on one rash day in November 2012, when we happened to be in the same city at the same time, to see if that's something we could attempt to do. And here we are today. So one of the recommendations that came out of that position statement was that we should support work in conjunction with service users on developing a multifactorial and contextual approach which incorporates social, psychological and biological factors. So we have attempted to take that recommendation forward. Here are the contributors to the project over a 5-year period, mostly psychologists because it's a psychology project, but we have also have 2 survivors as part of our core project team. We have a group of just over 40 other people who've contributed very helpfully in various ways over the 5 years. We have had a consultancy group of service users carers. I believe some of them are here today. We had a critical reader group to advise on diversity issues. We've had a number of other expert contributions, and we've had people giving us examples of good practice that is not diagnostically based. So we've benefited from a wide range of expertise, and these are people who also come from a range of professional backgrounds, mostly psychology, but also nursing, social work, psychiatry, and a number of expert by experience backgrounds. Okay, and this is just to kind of give you the tour of the document. That is another not very catchy title, isn't it? The Power Threat Meaning Framework. That long title, or rather the title with a long subtitle, refers to the main document. That's going to be available online, but not in a printed version, and it's going to be available from Monday. That's the website address. So what that main document consists of, it's a very, very detailed overview of the philosophical conceptual principles, the roles of social, psychological and biological causal factors, the consultancy we undertook, and the relevant supporting evidence. And there is a chapter which I think most of you will probably want to look at, even if you don't look at the whole thing, which is chapter 8. We're going to give you some edited highlights of that today, but it's essentially various ideas and suggestions about how to translate non-diagnostic principles into practice in all the areas in which diagnosis is currently used and thought to be necessary. We argue that there are alternatives. Okay, so you might want to use that document, well, you might want to use it not at all. You might want to dip into it because within each of the chapters there are very thorough overviews of each of the main areas of social, psychological and biological contributory factors to distress. And as I say, you might want to look at some of the practical implications. The reason it's quite long and dense is because we took our task very seriously, and if we're promoting something as ambitious as we are trying to, then really what we needed to do was rethink it from scratch. This is partly why it was such a long and at times very painful and confusing process. We don't just want different words to the same old ideas. We want to really rethink from scratch. We want to produce something that we hope is conceptually sound, empirically based and suitable for putting into practice. So that's the main version. The current version, now this should be online now, I don't know if it is, but if it isn't, perhaps someone can let me know. This is the version you have in your conference pack. So this is, in essence, it's chapter 6 of the main document. It's the framework itself, but omitting most of the kind of build-up on the philosophical and conceptual evidence-based kind of scene setting. And it has an addition to the main document in that it has a number of appendices. Appendix 1 is a guided discussion about the framework, which we are suggesting as a starting point for thinking about how you might talk through these ideas with someone you're working with or with a friend or perhaps as applied to yourself. You're going to have a chance to try that this afternoon if you want. And there are also a number of appendices giving good practice examples, as I've said. In your pack, you will also see a very brief description of the framework in a kind of 2-side summary That's free to plagiarise, free to use, free to adapt, should you want a very brief way to explain what the principles and aims of the framework are to colleagues or friends or self-help groups or anyone else who might be interested in hearing about it. So that's the easy read summary. Okay, so as we've already heard, this is not an official DCP or BPS model. It's not a replacement for all existing models and practices. We're not saying stop what you're doing now and do this instead. We are suggesting a meta framework which we hope supports a lot of good existing practice and perhaps enriches it and suggests ways in which it could be further developed and also suggests other productive ways forward. And we really don't want this to be seen as just for professional service user group. We all suffer from distress. We all struggle at times. We hope this framework is applicable for all of us. And as Esther said, we're really seeing this today as the end of the first stage, which is producing this rather thick, dense document. We hope that some of you at least will join with us in wanting to start implementing it and putting the principles into practice. And we don't know what that's going to look like. We hope you're going to come up with ideas. This is optional, of course. The one thing we are not doing, have no desire to do, and indeed no power to do, is to say everyone's got to do this. It may or may not be of interest to you, and if you simply have a great day in London and leave early to go shopping and enjoy the lunch, that's fine. And if you want to take on the project in a greater detail than that, we would be delighted, and we'd be delighted to keep in contact with you. So that's the scene setting. Okay. I hope I'm not going to be the first person to run over time. That would be uncharacteristic, but possible. Okay. So I'm going to talk very briefly through the principles of the document and the project you're about to hear about. I think Mary coined this phrase, the DSM mindset. What we're essentially trying to do is move beyond what we call the DSM mindset, which in essence is about applying theories and models intended to understand the body to people's thoughts, feelings and behaviours. Perhaps I ought to say at this point that if it took us 5 years to reach this point, we're really not expecting everyone to take this on board immediately and easily this morning or today. If it seems a bit dense and complicated, if you can go with the flow, you can revisit it by reading the main documents, and our main aim is to give you the kind of edited highlights, if you like. Don't worry if some of it does require a bit of thinking, that's part of the purpose of it. So instead of a medicalised approach, we need a framework for understanding people in their social relationship context, which sees them as actively making choices and creating meaning in their lives within inevitable bodily, material, social and ideological constraints. Okay. And also a framework that recognises that emotional distress and troubling behaviour are intelligible, understandable responses to a person's history and circumstances, restores the link between distress and social injustice, really important, increases access to power and resources, helps to create validating narratives, and promotes social action. Okay. And because of the kind of crisis, as we would see it in the diagnostic paradigm, there's already quite a lot of work going on from various social and psychological perspectives to do some of this. And we've drawn on some of that work, quite a lot of it, in our project, but what we feel in our overview is that a lot of this research and thinking gets kind of stuck at these points. Everything causes everything, everyone has experienced everything, and everyone suffers from everything. In other words, all types of adverse circumstances and events seem to raise the risk for all types of mental health presentation, and most people who've been around in services for a time will collect a range of diagnoses, as we know. There doesn't seem to be anything very specific in the patterns of what causes what leads to what causal factors raise the risk for what kind of difficulties later on. So what we're trying to do, very ambitiously, is to try and to identify patterns within what at the moment looks like rather a confusing mix of factors. Okay, and just to kind of elaborate on that a bit, most of us, or a lot of us, probably most of us in the room, if not all of us, will be already working at a one-to-one level in largely or partly non-diagnostic ways. Okay, and so as psychologists, we use something called formulation. There are other versions of that, constructs, a range of non-Western conceptualizations of distress. So at a one-to-one level, we have alternatives to diagnosis. Most of us are probably using those. What we don't have is a bigger framework for identifying broader patterns of distress and unusual experiences, which can be used then for fulfilling more effectively the purposes of diagnosis. Hope that makes sense to you. But it's worth saying at this point that although we have touched on formulation in the project, we have not really made a big deal about formulation as such, partly because we're not seeing this as a psychology project. We hope it draws on such a wide range of intellectual traditions and conceptual traditions that it's quite hard to identify it, and indeed I hope it can't be identified as a specifically psychology product. We certainly hope now it's been released into the wild that people will take it on for themselves, make of it what they want. And there is a little bit of paranoia sometimes about, psychologists want to take over the world with formulation. You'd be surprised how little of the document is devoted to formulation. We have deliberately chosen the word narrative instead. Narrative is a more encompassing word. Narrative includes a whole range of ways we can make sense of experience through all sorts of not necessarily written or verbal means. So it's about narrative and not formulation specifically, although there are some implications for formulation. So what is diagnosis about? The main purposes of medical diagnosis are, as you can see there. I'll leave you to read that. So the main purposes of medical diagnosis, we need to be able to demonstrate that we can meet all those purposes differently and better in any kind of alternative framework we propose, and we believe that actually we do have some ideas about how we can do that differently and better by developing different kinds of patterns that are not based on ideas about or theories about what goes wrong in the body, but patterns that are more suitable for understanding human emotional distress and suffering. Okay, this is a kind of an instant summary of the framework, if you like. I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase, instead of asking what's wrong with you, instead of asking what's wrong with me, ask what's happened to me. It's a kind of a popular survivor slogan which encapsulates, I think, very neatly the shift that we need to make. And in developing the project, we have expanded that question. So instead of asking what's wrong with you, what has happened to you? And in terms of the framework, we are interpreting that as how has power operated in your life. We're going to explain that in a minute. How did it affect you? In terms of the framework, we interpret that as what kind of threats did this pose? What sense did you make of it? In terms of the framework, what was the meaning of those experiences to you? What did you have to do to survive? In terms of the framework, what kinds of threat response are you using? Now, if you follow through on those 4 questions and the evidence that brings up and the personal testimony and the experience, then you end up with something that we think can be used to identify patterns that emerge out of the answers to those 4 questions, which you're going to hear about. It's worth saying at this point that although we've kind of developed this sort of reasonably memorable way of remembering it, I hope, power, threat, meaning and threat response, it's a convenient summary. We are not seeing these as separate, independent elements. We will be explaining this as well. It's not this plus this plus this. It's not a different version of biopsychosocial. You cannot talk about power without implying threat. You cannot talk about threat without implying where it came from and usually what your response to it is. So it's a convenient way of describing it, but these are interlinked, interdependent aspects arising out of each other. So if we're able to identify broad patterns of meaning-based threat responses to the negative operation of power, that's another key sentence, if you like, the essence of the framework, identifying broad patterns of meaning-based threat responses to the negative operation of power. You will understand that a bit better by the end of the morning, I hope. This can help us to construct individual, family, group, social narratives of all types, inside or outside services, supported or not supported by professionals. And as I've said, it's narratives in a general sense, and as I've said, it is broader than any specific model or any specific set of practices, but can be used to expand, enrich existing models and practices. So when we've done preview presentations, people have quite commonly said things like, that sounds a bit like cognitive analytic therapy, or that sounds a bit like schema therapy, or that sounds a bit like community psychology. And indeed, it sounds a bit like all of those. It probably sounds a bit like trauma-informed practice as well. But we're actually seeing it as bigger than all of those. We have For example, we've drawn quite a lot on trauma-informed practice, but we also have some criticism to make of trauma-informed practice. And the framework is a perspective from which to see all of those models and synthesise some of the most useful aspects of them. Okay, and as I said, there are a number of appendices of good practice. So again, the message isn't stop doing what you're doing and do this instead. The message is carry on the good work, and this may support you further with it. Okay. This is another important aspect, a central aspect of the framework. While most mental health, in the broad sense, work is aimed at the individual, we argue that meaning and distress must also be understood at social, community and cultural levels. Thus, we see the PTM framework as applying equally to understanding intervention and social action in a wider sense. I don't know if you're familiar with this recent and I think very brave and inspiring United Nations report recommending a shift of focus towards from chemical imbalance to power imbalance. A powerful and a memorable phrase. I'm just going to reiterate the 4 key questions. What has happened to you? How did it affect you? What sense did you make of it? What did you have to do to survive? If you're translating that into action with other people or on your own behalf, you also need to think about these 2 additional questions. What are your strengths? And we're interpreting that as what access to power resources do you have? And to integrate all the above, what is your story? Okay, well, amazingly enough, I seem to be ahead of time. So far, so good. What we're now going to do is to talk you through in more detail of those 4 key elements: power, threat, meaning and threat response. And then after the break, I'm going to kind of integrate the whole thing and talk about the patterns.
Thank you. Well, as Lucy has said and really emphasised, one of the central parts of the framework is the idea that what we often call, or what are often called, psychiatric symptoms are very meaningful, very understandable responses to life's circumstances and difficulties. Now, one of the most problematic aspects of diagnosis is that it can convey exactly the opposite message. And the DSM actually makes clear that the absence of meaning is part of diagnosis, and that to justify a diagnosis, someone's distress and their behaviour usually has to fall outside of normal frameworks of understanding. Now, there's a lot being done to challenge this and to restore meaning, and, for example, through formulation. And to be fair, psychiatry has also focused on people's circumstances through research linking those to particular diagnostic categories. But there does seem to be a more widespread reluctance to confront the nature of the contexts which actually produce mental health problems. So, for example, these contexts are often depicted as something out there. They're quantifiable categories, quite separate from us. They're described often as triggers or stresses or life events. They're seen as interacting with genetic or biological or psychological dysfunctions or deficits. And then it's these supposed dysfunctions and deficits which then get more attention than the contexts themselves. And this has the effect not just of separating us from our social context, but of making it not just secondary, but often quite invisible. And it also creates an easy route back to diagnostic or semi-diagnostic models and to seeing problems in terms of individual characteristics, some version or other of vulnerability stress framework. So we had to get beyond all this in our project, and we had to look very differently at the contexts which are linked to mental health problems and also at people's responses to them. And what's often missing from discussions of social context is that virtually every risk factor for mental health problems is also a marker for inequalities of power. And just think of the list. Things like poverty, domestic and sexual violence, child abuse, unemployment, racial discrimination, and so on. So our first alternative to the diagnostic question, what's wrong with you, isn't only what's happened to you, but also how has power operated in your life? And so what do we mean by power? Well, it's not an entity or possession, but a complex set of processes and interacting processes, what's more. And here's some 3 definitions I've pulled out of the literature. The means of obtaining security and advantage, being able to influence your environment to meet your own needs and interests, or a socially situated capacity to control others' actions. Now, it's also the case that because the operation of power so strongly patterns our experience of the world, we can think of it as a major way that the social world gets inside our heads and our bodies, so that power links the social, the psychological, and the biological. Now, theorists sometimes talk about different types of power, and that can be misleading, but it does highlight the different ways power operates and how its processes interact. So, in the framework, we've drawn on several different forms of power, or types of power. First of all, biological and embodied power, which operates through the possession of socially valued or embodied attributes like attractiveness, fertility, strength, embodied talents and abilities, physical health, and so on. Then coercive power, or power by force, involving use of violence, aggression, or threats to frighten, intimidate, or ensure compliance. Legal power can involve coercion, of course, but it's also rules and sanctions which support or limit other aspects of power. It offers and restricts choices. Economic and material power, that's having the means to obtain valued possessions or services, to control others' access to them, and to pursue valued activities. Interpersonal power, now all forms of power can operate through relationships, but this more specifically referring to power to look after, not look after, or protect someone, to leave them, to give or withdraw, or withhold affection, and so on. Then social or cultural capital, a mix of valued qualifications, knowledge, connections, which eases people's way through life and can be passed indirectly to the next generation in a kind of symbolic inheritance process. And then finally, but absolutely not least, ideological power, involving control of language, meaning, and perspective. Now, it involves the power to create theories that are accepted as true, or to create beliefs or stereotypes about particular groups, the power to interpret your own or others' behavior and feelings and have those meanings validated by others, and also the power to silence or undermine. Now, these forms of power are very closely connected, and they affect all of us. They operate through social structures, institutions, organizations, through our physical environment, through the media, through education, scientific research, and social and family relations. They also operate, of course, in psychological and psychiatric theory and practice. And of course, they operate both intentionally and unintentionally. This is not about conspiracy theories. Now, one of the most striking things about the operation of power is how opaque it so often is. The contexts that it creates can seem like just the way things are, and we can all find it difficult to see the bigger picture beyond our more immediate concerns. And this isn't helped at all by the fact that those who benefit from current systems of power are very often keen to hide how it operates. Now, above all, its ideological power, this last one, itself, it is the least visible form which helps to hide the operation of other forms of power. And that reflects its role in shaping meaning and perspective, or what's seen as truth or fact. It shapes our identities, how we account for our behavior. It's probably not accidental that psychology and psychiatry play a massive role in this, but actually have very little to say about the actual topic of power. So in our project, and this is detailed in the main publication, we've examined the meaningful connections between the operation of various forms of power and diagnostically labelled ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And we've looked at 4 key areas: childhood adversity, gender, race and ethnicity, and social class and poverty. And of course, that's not the only areas, but we had to limit it in some way. And there are differences, of course, in how this all plays out for different groups, but there's also many, many commonalities. And what we've done is that we describe how, when power operates negatively against our interests, it can create very aversive psychosocial contexts. For example, unpredictability and low control over important outcomes, or entrapment, where people are unable to escape aversive environments, or conflict, whether it's intrapsychic, relational, or social, or negative constructions of you and your group, because meaning is in other people's hands, or repeated exposure to violence, aggression, humiliation, or criticism, and so on. And in turn, these contexts can involve a range of threats, which takes us to our second question: how did this affect you? What kinds of threats did it pose? And these threats include, this isn't an exhaustive list, but, for example, relational threats, threats of rejection, abandonment, or isolation, emotional threats, threats of overwhelming emotions or loss of control, social community threats to social roles, social status, community links, or yourself in the eyes of others, or economic material threats to financial security, to your housing, simply to being able to meet your basic needs, or environmental threats to your safety and security, to links with the natural world. So, for example, for people living in high crime areas or just a neglected and run down area with no natural features. And then bodily threats, threats of violence, bodily invasion, or physical ill health. Or threats to your value base, threats to beliefs, your basic values, or threats to meaning making, that is, threats to your ability to create valued meanings about important aspects of your life, and the threat of having other people's meanings imposed on you. Now, all forms of power can be involved in creating these aversive contexts and threats, but we've paid particular attention to the negative operation of ideological power, that is, power over meaning, language, and perspective. And there are several reasons why we've done this. First of all, it's probably the least visible and least acknowledged form of power. And therefore, perhaps it's the most difficult form to resist because of its potential to create threats to identity, to make one person or one group's views, point of view, less valuable than others, and to obscure the causes of distress. A second reason is that ideological power underlies the conversion of social context to intrapsychic or biological characteristics, and that can make context completely invisible. So, for example, there's the unemployed benefits claimant who's told that their problem is low self-esteem or external locus of control, or perhaps women who are told that they could earn more if only they'd overcome their fear of success, or anyone who's told that they're depressed because they have a biochemical imbalance, and so on. And then third, ideological power is part of every other form of power. So, for example, it's difficult to understand the legal outcomes, i.e. legal power, surrounding rape or girl sexual exploitation without understanding the cultural meanings of women as temptresses and men as helpless in the face of their sexual urges. And then in a different sphere, it would have been very difficult to implement the economic policies of the last few years without the parallel ideological project to transform the meaning of poverty and unemployment from social problems to psychological problems. Those of you who are a bit older, like me in the audience, will remember when those problems were seen as social and may not quite appreciate the massive shift in meaning that has come about now to seeing them as psychological. And more generally than that, the social and material power, or the lack of it, that certain groups have, depends on deeply embedded beliefs about the nature and character of group members. And this is one reason why simply passing laws or rules about equality, which rely on legal power, often just doesn't work very well. But then, on the other hand, the ability to use ideological power to create influential meanings depends on access to other forms of power, through wealth, through ethnicity, through gender, the media, education, the law, and of course being able to draw on the credibility of science. And the lack of access to these forms of power means that your ability to create influential meanings or to resist other people's meanings can be very limited. And then fourth, and related to that, ideological power is central to the experience of invalidation. And we've paid quite a lot of attention to this in the documents. So having your perspective or point of view overlooked or dismissed or trivialised or silenced is part of the daily life of subordinate groups. It's very strongly associated with distress, and especially when it's done very forcibly, although we shouldn't underestimate the cumulative effect of subtle invalidation across the lives of subordinate groups. So, for example, sexual harassment, sexual abuse or assault often involves victims being told that they want it, they asked for it, they deserve it, they should have stopped it, or even that it didn't happen. And this can play havoc with memory and processing of these events. And the impact, the apparent truth of these imposed meanings doesn't just come from an imbalance of power unique to one situation, but from their roots in much wider cultural meanings. So these perpetrator-imposed meanings are often reinforced and amplified, sometimes when the person seeks help or just tells someone about it. And potentially this can produce very long-lasting shame, humiliation, and of course silence. And then fifth, ideological power is important in its more general and ever-present role in shaping the sense we can make of aversive and threatening contexts, with implications for actions. It also shapes the sense professionals make of these contexts and how far one person's meanings will take precedence over someone else's. So, inevitably, faced with the kinds of aversive and threatening contexts which are created by the negative operation of power, people try to protect themselves. Now, John and Lucy are going to say more about these threat responses and about the importance of meaning. But I'll just finish with three more general points about power. The first is that linking threat and threat responses to the operation of power highlights the absolute inseparability of the social, the psychological, and the biological, but, and this is really important, in very different ways and which offer very different possibilities for theory and action, either from biopsychosocial or vulnerability stress models. And as we are going to see, linking the operation of power and threat responses also allows us to see patterns of distress quite different from diagnostic ones. It highlights the role of biology as an enabler, a mediator, and a limitation, rather than a fundamental cause in any medicalized way. And, as Lucy was emphasizing, it creates links to social justice and social action. and, above all, makes it much more difficult to backslide into individualistic or diagnostic explanations. A second point is that the less access you have to conventional or approved forms of power, you're much more likely to adopt socially disturbing or disruptive strategies in the face of adversity. This isn't deliberate, sometimes not even conscious. People protect themselves as best they can. And it's not that privileged people don't experience threat and adversity. They have far more access to socially accepted or tolerated ways of dealing with them, even if some of these are damaging to other people. And all this reminds us that judgments about mental illness are always social judgments. And then a final point. Power also operates positively. We talk a lot about the negative operation of power inevitably, because we're talking about distress and patterns of distress, but it does operate positively through supportive relationships, education, employment, humane policy and services, social solidarity, social action, and so on. And what's clear is that it's often accessing one or more of these positive forms of power which marks the first step in constructive change. And it's also the differential access to these more positive aspects of power within disadvantaged groups which accounts for some of the variation in the impact of adversity. Now, unfortunately, this more positive operation of power is already being translated to an intrapsychic characteristic called resilience. And so yet again, almost before the words are out of our mouths, the social context and especially inequalities of power are being made invisible. So one of the things we hope for our framework is that it will make these things as visible as possible. So, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about meanings, threat responses, and then linking threats to threat responses. Meaning is a central component of the power threat meaning framework, so I'll first of all sketch the concept of meaning that we developed as part of the framework. I'll show how this links to threat responses and how threat responses themselves therefore can be seen as meaningful. But of course, as Mary said, within diagnostic and biomedical models, the whole idea of people's unusual experiences being meaningless is a key requirement for them to count as symptoms. So in the final part of my talk, I'm going to talk about how we can look at the ways the connections between threats and threat responses have been severed and understand how it can be difficult to make those kinds of connections. So human beings actively make sense of our worlds. Our behaviour is intentional and meaningful, and it serves important purposes. That's fairly self-evidently true, I think, and probably not that controversial. But what do we mean by meaning? Now, this seems like quite a perverse question to ask, doesn't it? What does meaning actually mean? And you might think I'm just trying to baffle you with some kind of philosophical waffle. But stick with me, because what I hope you'll appreciate in a few minutes' time is that if we ask that question, it takes us somewhere quite interesting. The first thing it raises for us is the realisation that individual meanings are actually quite complicated things, and they're not homogeneous. They contain different elements, typically. They contain elements of language, for example. They contain elements of memories. They're constituted or shaped or consist of feelings and bodily responses. They're shaped by our environments and our resources. And of course, they're also shaped by expectations about what is normal in a given society. These could be, for example, ethnic or gender stereotypes, to pick just two amongst a whole range of societal expectations that might shape the kind of meanings that we encounter or find in our everyday lives. So meaning is a multidimensional, complex achievement. What's absolutely vital about this, and why it's helpful then to break meaning down into its separate components, is that it shows us that none of these elements are simply individual matters. Language, for example, is learned through our interactions with other people. We don't get to choose the language that we learn when we grow up. We're born into a culture where one language, or if we're fortunate, perhaps more than one language predominate, and that language or those languages are the ones that we acquire as we grow up. We use those languages to make sense of our own activities, of the activities of other people around us, the world that we find ourselves a part of. But the language isn't ours in any straightforward or simple sense. It pre-existed us. After we're gone, it'll still be there. We partake of a language, we share a language with other people, but it's not simply ours. It goes beyond us. It has constraints and limitations built into it that are specific to that language, that shape the kind of meanings it's possible to easily make within the words, within the grammar that language supplies. Memories. Memories obviously reflect things that have happened to us. They reflect our experiences. This means we can't simply choose what we remember. Even more vitally in the present context, we can't simply choose what we forget. And memories of painful, shaming or traumatic events, for example, are particularly difficult for people to remember, to forget very often. Bodily reactions and feelings are shaped by learned responses over time. We acquire habits of feeling in certain circumstances. And of course, we can't easily choose how we feel. We can't easily choose how our bodies will respond to different situations, different threats, different circumstances. These things are largely out of our control. We find ourselves feeling as we do, we find our bodies reacting as they do, and we're kind of catching up after the event or making sense of our feelings after the event. Bodily reactions, bodily feelings reflect the situations, the circumstances we find ourselves within. They're part of the actual social and material world we occupy. They're not simply chosen by us. We all come from different environments and we have different access to resources. And these environments and resources also shape and constrain the meanings we're able to make. So Mary talked about the importance of social context. But of course, when you think about meaning, context is also a constituent of meaning. Context helps to produce meaning. We don't simply get to look at a context and think, well, I'm going to ignore that bit of context and focus on this bit. The context already shapes and constrains the meanings it's possible for us to make. The meaning of not being able to buy any food of an evening because you haven't got any money is very different if you haven't got any money because the cash point happened not to be working, or you haven't got any money because you're on benefits and your money has run out and you just actually need to starve that night. It's a very different meaning to this, what's ostensibly, superficially, the same kind of set of circumstances. Also, how we should feel, for example, when something difficult happens, is always shaped by dominant cultural ideas, by expectations, by norms, by shared values. If we think about gendered expectations around emotionality, for example, the expectation that men should have a stiff upper lip, that big boys don't cry, that women are weaker and more emotional than men, for example, these kind of expectations, these stereotypical ideas about men and women, we may reject them, but even though we may reject them or question them, they still shape the ways in which we are able to think and react ourselves. They still shape the ways that we understand our own responses by setting up expectations that we have to either align ourselves with or overcome. All this means that individual meanings are never just freely chosen. This is an absolutely key point. In this framework, we're not saying that there are some people who persist for whatever purposes, whatever reasons, in persistently creating deviant meanings, and it's their habits of creating deviant meanings that need to be addressed. That's absolutely not what we're getting at here. People don't get to simply choose the meanings that they make. Meanings are both made and found, in the words of psychologist John Schotter. The things that we do and the things that we say do contribute to the meanings that we experience, but they don't contribute in a vacuum. Our circumstances, our histories, our biographies, our bodies, our bodily responses, our access to resources, our social and material conditions, the norms, values and expectations of our society, the identities that we're aligned with, all of these things and more also contribute to the meanings that we make of the things that happen in our lives. Meaning is not something that's simply individually created by us. We create it, we use it, we manage it, but within circumstances that are not of our own free choice. Meaning then is inseparable from relationships, from bodies and biological capacities, and from the expectations and messages of society and culture. It's also, of course, inseparable from threats, from the impacts of power, and from our responses to those threats. So I'll now go on to talk a bit about threat responses. So threat responses then are not symptoms. They're meaningful responses to threats. They reflect attempts to adapt, to survive, to endure, to keep safe, maybe even to thrive. They're both evolved and acquired. And what we mean by this is that they are, on the one hand, a product of present circumstances and past experiences, but they're also a product of bodily, embodied or biological capacities. They're a product of the things that our bodies make possible for us to do. Our bodies and brain systems have general capacities to remember, to feel, to form habits, and so on. And threat responses also reflect those general bodily or biological capacities. They reflect cultural and social standards and norms and the expectations and values that we encounter and that are placed upon us. And of course, they also reflect the possibilities and limitations of our environments. The kind of threat response we're able to adopt or use will reflect the actual social and material circumstances we find ourselves in at that time. Faced with some kinds of threat, the most obvious thing, certainly, at least from my point of view, is to run away and just pretend it's not there. Let me get out of this horrible situation. But running away isn't always possible. It isn't always even adaptive. It depends on the actual circumstances you find yourself in. So threat responses also reflect the actual social and material circumstances of the environment that you're in at that point in time. Here are some examples of threat responses. Is that towards the top end of the list, there are responses that we experience ourselves as making more or less consciously. They're things that we experience ourselves as being able to choose or to decide to do. Things like preparing to fight, to flee, to escape, to seek safety, to submit, to appease, to give up, and so on. These things seem to us, as we do them, more or less under our control. Towards the bottom end of the list are things that we experience as more or less out of our control. They're more sort of automatic, more sort of involuntary responses. But what they all share is they all, of course, are responses to threats. They're all responses to the operation of power in our lives. They also, of course, look exactly like, in many ways, the kinds of lists of symptoms we see in diagnostic models. But what we're trying to do here by understanding these as threat responses rather than as symptoms, we're trying to begin to restore the link with meaning that the diagnostic model breaks. Threat responses are not random. They reflect what's happened to people. They reflect how they've coped, in other words, what they did to survive. And they reflect their circumstances. They reflect what it is possible for people to do. They are, or at least they were, functional. They might not be functional now, but at least in the past they did serve some kind of important function. They are attempts to deal with the operation of power and the threats that the operation of power creates for people. And those threats can be emotional, physical, or social. They can be threats to identity. They can be threats to relationships or within relationships. They can be threats to community. They can be threats to values and to meanings. They can be all of those things at once. They can be combinations of those things. But threat responses are attempts to deal with threats of those different kinds. They can be grouped into functional patterns, and we've got here two examples of functional patterns. Okay, so the first thing to say about these two sets of functional patterns then is that they are functional. They are about trying to address the operation of power. They are about trying to respond to the presence of threats in people's lives. They look like lists of symptoms, and of course that is entirely the point. But what we're doing here is rebuilding the link between threats, responses, and meaning. We're trying to say that unlike diagnostic models where symptoms are essentially meaningless, within the framework we're putting forward, these things that the diagnostic model calls symptoms are threat responses that represent meaningful responses to threats that are produced by the operation of power. They can serve different functions, and they can cut across what, as you can see from the list, they cut across various diagnostic categories. The two patterns we've presented on these slides are largely consisting of of different kinds of threat responses, so they're largely separate. But of course, there's no reason why a particular response couldn't appear in more than one pattern. And you'll see in the full document that some of these responses do recur across the patterns. This might seem, from a diagnostic perspective, as being a bit of a strange thing to do, but of course, from a meaning-based perspective, where what you're understanding is that what people are doing is responding to threats using the resources available to them in the circumstances they find themselves in, it makes a lot of sense that sometimes the same kind of response might serve different or slightly different functions in different or slightly different circumstances when faced with the operation of slightly different kinds of threats. As Mary said, and as I've repeated, one of the things the diagnostic model does is it severs the link between meaning and unusual experiences. So to be counted as a symptom of a disorder, then experiences have to be seen as essentially meaningless. They're the product of biological or embodied capacities gone wrong. They're the reflection of some kind of embodied disorder at work. If we're going to understand how this kind of thinking is plausible, we need to try to understand why it is that the links between threats and responses are not more obvious. And there's a number of reasons for this, which I'm now going to go through. One of the most pervasive reasons is that the threat or the operation of power may be less obvious because it's subtle, cumulative, or socially acceptable. If you grow up in a world that is racist, for example, then this will threaten your identity if you're part of an ethnic minority. But because racism is so ingrained in our society, it may be hard to see that this is affecting your experience. You may castigate yourself for not being stronger, for not being able to fend off these ideas that tend to devalue you, precisely because these ideas are so widespread and so normalised in a racist society. The threat might often be distant in time. Things that have happened in early childhood can profoundly shape our experiences and profoundly shape the kinds of responses we go on to produce when we're faced with different threats as we get older. But it's difficult for us to make coherent connections quite often between things that happened in our early lives and the responses we find ourselves adopting later on as adults. For some people, the threats may be so numerous and the responses to them so many and so varied that it's pretty much impossible to make coherent connections. Their experience of the threats and responses might be disorganised, confused and obscured. Conversely, rather than having some kind of block of dramatic events, people may have experienced an accumulation of apparently minor threats and adversities consistently over a long period of time. And if you look at any one of those things by itself, it might seem, well, that's just an ordinary kind of everyday thing that people have to overcome. Because what you have to be looking at is the overall circumstances of people's lives, the extent of challenges and adversities they've been faced with, and of course the availability or the presence of any kind of supportive or ameliorative relationships that might help people to deal with those threats and those different threats and challenges. Sometimes threat responses can take unusual or extreme forms. For example, bizarre beliefs or hearing voices, self-harm or self-starvation. And when responses take this form, again, it can be more difficult to make coherent connections between the response itself and the things that happen to people, notwithstanding the fact that there is typically a logic to these kinds of experiences. So the kind of voices that people hear, for example, do often contain some kind of logic that reflects things that happens to them, but it's not necessarily a straightforward everyday logic. And so it may not be easily possible, as an observer anyway, to make those kinds of connections. There are other reasons why it's difficult to make the links between threats and threat responses. The person might not realise the link for themselves. Memory loss, dissociation could be part of their coping strategies, part of their threat responses. And if people are experiencing memory loss or dissociating, then almost by definition they're going to find it hard to coherently make connections between the things that have happened in their lives and the kind of responses they find themselves adopting as a consequence. Another reason why people in distress themselves might find it hard to make those links is that they might become accustomed to denying them. Because acknowledging the connections might have felt, or actually been, not just felt dangerous, but been dangerous, might have felt stigmatizing, might have felt shaming. We might have been encouraged by powerful others to disavow the connections between how we feel, how we respond, and what has happened to us or has happened to us. It might be advantageous in terms of our own safety to disavow those connections, and so on. And of course, these kind of disavowals are also encouraged by wider social, cultural expectations and values and norms to do with, on the one hand, issues of personal blame and weakness, and on the other hand, issues of personal responsibility, the idea that you should be able to pull yourself together, you should be able to just cope, be a man, so on and so forth. Mary mentioned the operation of ideological power, and ideological power is also enshrined within professional models, and it permeates professional training. And this includes the training of most mental health professionals. There is an ideological aspect to mental health training for the most part, and that includes the training of psychologists, of course. For many mental health professionals, they're encouraged to work within a diagnostic model that imposes a powerful expert narrative about individual illness and disorder, which, as we've seen, tends to break the link between threats and threat responses by casting those threat responses as meaningless symptoms of biological disorders. And this, again, makes it more difficult to make connections between threats and threat responses, not least because people have to use these services and survive within these services, and therefore the power of professionals to use these narratives shapes the meanings that service users themselves are able to make. There is wider social resistance to recognising the common and damaging impact of negative uses of power. In psychology, this is sometimes described as the just world hypothesis, the idea that everything's okay really, we just need to trim things around the edges a bit, that abuse is a rare occurrence, that power is mostly benevolent and legitimate, so on and so forth. There are lots of vested interests that depend upon this kind of worldview. And these interests can be personal, they can be family, they can be professional, they can be organisational, they can be community, they can operate through businesses and institutions, they can be about the protection of economic advantage or political power. By disconnecting threats from threat responses and preserving the individual illness or disorder model, various power relationships are bolstered or protected. So, for example, there is accumulating evidence at the moment that so-called austerity, the ideologically governed programme of cutting health, welfare, education and social services, has caused an increase in mortality, a rise in mental ill health and a rise in various other health problems, at the same time has reduced the capacity of services to adapt to this and to respond to these threats. If these health problems are cast as illnesses, biologically based and caused, then it's harder to make the connection with so-called austerity. So this is just one example of the ways in which severing the link between meaning threats and threat responses and casting threat responses as meaningless symptoms helps to bolster the operation of power in an ideological sense. All this produces a situation where people are never, or many people, are never offered sound, evidence-based alternative frameworks to make sense of their own and other people's distressing or unusual experiences. Miranda Fricker has talked about this in terms of what she calls epistemic injustice. So by epistemic, she means to do with knowledge, to do with the things that we can know and we can understand, the kind of frameworks of understanding and evidence that are available to us. And what she says is that many disadvantaged groups are deprived, systematically deprived, of shared social resources with which to make of their sense of their experiences, and that this is due to unequal power relations. And so damaging or discrediting or devaluing experiences, which reflect the operation of power, then become even more difficult to understand and to reposition within the dynamics of power, precisely because the groups that are subject to these devaluing experiences are also deprived of the frameworks that would help them to make sense of how this has actually occurred. And that's where we come in, and that's where I hand back to Lucy.
Thank you. How are you doing? It's nearly time for tea, coffee and pastries. Okay, I'm going to do a little bit of a recap. Having heard a little bit more in detail about the core elements of power, threat, meaning and threat response, I want to return to the initial question, which is what kind of evidence-based patterns emerge from integrating the influences of power, threat, meaning and associated threat responses. I'm only going to give you the headlines. The details are all in the document, which you all now have a copy of, but I want to indicate the general area that we're in and the general conclusions we've come to. So what we've attempted to do by carrying out a detailed review of the evidence about power, threat, meaning and threat responses is to outline a provisional set of broad patterns in distress to replace the ones that diagnosis supposedly identifies in distress and does so, we think, very unsuccessfully. These offer what has been missing so far, a way of helping to construct individual families, groups, social narratives, inside or outside services, supported or not by professionals, as well as to suggest alternative ways of fulfilling the other functions of diagnosis. Okay. So we've provisionally outlined 7 general patterns, which are very different from the kind of medical patterns that we're usually seeing, but that we're used to seeing or used to kind of being told fit the understanding of emotional suffering and mental distress. Because these patterns cut across diagnostic categories, as do the threat responses. So there is no such thing as a pattern for people who would otherwise be labelled with schizophrenia or personality disorder and so on. They cut across specialties. I mean, a lot of the research tells us that people who end up in a whole range of different parts of our welfare services have very common roots to their distress and their difficulties. Most importantly, they cut across so-called normal and abnormal. They cut across people who are psychiatrically labelled and all of us. This is not a framework for a group of people called mentally ill. This is a framework that applies to all of us to a greater or lesser extent at some time in our lives. Okay, this is the key sentence in a way: patterns of embodied, meaning-based threat responses to the negative operation of power. So that description encapsulates the 4 key elements: power, threat, meaning and threat response. Patterns of embodied, meaning-based threat responses to the negative operation of power. And it's very important to get your head around what kind of patterns these are. These are not precise, neatly defined patterns, because human express and emotional suffering, shaped by personal meaning, shaped by social and ideological meanings, and organised by function, does not and could not fall into those kind of neat patterns. If we start to pursue that route, as I think many researchers have, we're not going to get very far. These are patterns that are intrinsically overlapping, provisional and changing. That is how the world is, that is how life is, that is how human beings are, that is how human beings live and respond to suffering and threat. And we have to acknowledge and embrace that uncertainty, I think, because it also gives us hope and ways forward. So these patterns are organised by meaning, not by biology. Yeah, meaning in the very complex sense that John's outlined to us. Because they're organised by meaning, not by biology, they will always reflect and be shaped by specific worldviews, social, historical, political and cultural contexts, and ideological meanings. So these patterns are not for one and all time, they're not all cross-culturally valid. We have again to accept that there will be variation because of the very fact that our meanings, our cultures, our ideologies also vary. Okay, so we've already heard that a lot of the origins of the meanings we make personally come from social discourses, from ideology. So it follows that those kind of discourses and meanings, social and ideological, will also be present in the descriptions of the patterns, because the patterns are shaped by meaning. So if we think about it in terms of Western or Westernized countries or cultures, and this is, the version of the framework that we have developed mainly because we ourselves come from a largely Western or Westernized culture. So the version you have in front of you is looking at patterns which mainly draw on struggles with Western norms and standards. So what kind of Western norms and standards do we all exist to try and live within and make sense of our lives within? They're sometimes so kind of deeply embedded that we don't always become consciously aware of them or question them. But actually, a large number of us in the room are part of a cultural tradition which says you need to separate from your family in early adulthood. It's not culturally universal, that expectation, is it, that 18-year-olds or 20-year-olds or so on should set off and set up their own independent nuclear family. And certainly my experience working in services a very long time is an awful lot of people run into trouble at that point. That sometimes manifests itself as something you might call psychosis, sometimes it manifests itself as something you might call OCD, whatever. There appear to be a number of ways people survive the very challenging expectations, particularly in current circumstances, the expectations you're going to go off and live the kind of successful life according to expected norms at really quite a young age. We are also expected, for example, to compete and achieve in line with social expectations. We're expected to meet our needs within a nuclear family structure. It's quite a big ask, isn't it? Quite a big ask. Of course, that's been extensively kind of discussed, particularly within feminist literature. How realistic is that? We are, as we all know, expected to fit in with standards about body size, shape and weight. I hardly need to point out that those kind of expectations influence an awful lot of what I call eating disorders. We are expected to fit in with expectations about gender identity and gender roles. We're expected to fit in with accepted views about the self. This is a harder one sometimes to be aware of, I think, but the idea that we are single unitary selves existing continuously over time is, again, not universally accepted. And some people will experience themselves as having a number of selves. And within a Western diagnostic perspective, that is definitely seen as abnormal, pathological. It doesn't have to be that. That is a specific type of cultural expectation. But if you experience yourself in that way, you're much more likely to receive a diagnosis. And the expectations we have about older adults, about children. These are all going to shape the patterns of distress that we commonly see. I'm assuming this is ringing some bells for some people, yeah? Okay, so these are the names of the 7 provisional patterns. The general patterns, I think, are the part of the document that probably needs most development, and I hope it will be developed and people will take it on and will think more about it. We've already got some ideas about that. So think of these as really quite provisional, if you like, but it's an attempt to establish in principle what a very broad set of patterns might look like. These are not patterns for particular people. It's likely, if you read in the document a summary of these patterns, and there's quite a detailed summary, that you will identify perhaps with 1 or 2 of them, and it's not meant to be some kind of neat match. But these are meant to encapsulate certain common meanings, and as you can see, they're described in verb form. These are things people do, not things people have. Okay, so it's about what you do, it's about how you survive, and it's expressed in terms of meaning. So, very roughly, pattern number 5, surviving defeat, entrapment, disconnection and loss. Some people who attract the diagnosis of depression would find themselves aligning with that pattern, but that pattern also describes people who have received different diagnoses, and equally people who have been given a diagnosis of depression may identify more with a different pattern. So it's certainly not a one-to-one match, but there are perhaps, to a very limited extent, the current diagnostic categories do sort of identify some patterns. So there's some overlap, but it's a fairly limited one. Okay, pattern number 6, surviving social exclusion, shame and coercive power. This describes quite a number of people, often men, who end up in the criminal justice system, but equally not everyone who ends up in the criminal justice system will feel that they're described by that, and equally that pattern might describe people who never end up there at all. Okay. So the general patterns are described in terms of meanings. They're described as what people do, not what they have. Verbs, not nouns, for those of you who studied grammar at school, to reflect the fact that they represent active, although not necessarily consciously chosen or controlled attempts to survive the negative operation of power. People will vary in their fit with one or more patterns, so patterns always need tailoring to the individual. There always has to be a process of what is your story. However, when you do that, of course, that allows you also, we'll have a chance to practice this afternoon if you're interested, to include positive aspects of power, protective aspects. So your story is also about what you, at least as much about what you survived, your strengths, your skills, your abilities, your access to power resources, as it is about the things that you may be struggling with. Okay. So just to kind of hammer the point home, if you like. The patterns are overlapping. There are regularities, but there are no simple causal links. There are not, and there could not be, hard and fast boundaries about the ways human beings respond to adversities. If you think about it, that doesn't actually make sense, does it? The patterns are probabilistic. We can never predict exactly what meaning people will make of events or how they will choose to respond. That's a good thing. That's not something to worry us. That's something to accept and embrace. People have the power to survive the most extraordinarily adverse circumstances. They are not one-to-one replacements for diagnostic categories. They are not explanations of specific so-called symptoms, such as low mood or panic, because the threat responses that are loosely applied, attached to each pattern, but also cut across patterns, are described in terms of their functions. How do people survive? What do they do to survive? And they cut across the usual boundaries of normal, abnormal, mad and sane, and so on. They also cut across the boundaries of socially valued behaviour. So, for example, one of the possible threat responses we've listed in the actual document is things like overwork. Okay, I own up to that one. One of my favourite threat responses. This is a socially valued response that is not traditionally seen as a symptom, but nevertheless, for some people at some times, it's no doubt people are using it as a kind of way of managing threat. And conversely, the things that are sometimes seen as symptoms, such as hearing voices, do not have to be seen as threat responses. They may be a valued and an everyday part of your life, which doesn't have to be understood within any particular kind of framework of distress. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the general patterns and their relation to non-Western concepts. Okay, hope your brains are still active and it is nearly time for tea. Because the patterns are based on meaning at personal, social and ideological levels, they will always be to an extent local to time, place and culture. Does that make sense? Yeah. So in non-Western or non-Westernised settings, patterns are likely to be shaped by different social norms, and these might include things like community rather than individual responses to stress being seen as the kind of dominant or the preferred way of understanding what's going on. There might be different concepts of the self. There may well be different histories, for example, of colonisation, which are bound to shape current meanings. So at a very core level, the core elements of power, threat, meaning and threat response can be found in all groups and societies, because as human beings we've all evolved to need to meet certain core needs, like the need to be accepted and valued and part of a social group and protected and loved and all the rest of it. And at a very core level, we've all evolved biologically as a species to respond in certain, often fairly automatic ways to threat. But at every level above that, think of the kind of rough hierarchy of threat responses, there's an increasing possibility that the threat responses will be shaped by local social discourses and meanings. Yeah, so there's going to be a lot of cultural variation at the top, less cultural variation at the bottom. So the power, threat, meaning framework both applies in a very broad sense, but certainly needs tailoring very much to particular cultures, and these general patterns I've just identified will certainly need tailoring to different cultural settings. Be very interested to see if anyone wants to take that work on. Okay, now one of the things that's always been a problem for DSM and ICD is how do we understand these apparently strange things that people do in non-Western cultures? I'm obviously saying that being rather sarcastic about the kind of strange way that we tend to look at things if we adopt a diagnostic lens. The power threat meaning framework looks at it very differently, because the power threat meaning framework predicts that there will be widely varying cultural experiences and expressions of distress, but it does not see these as bizarre, primitive, less valid or exotic variations of the dominant Western paradigm. Okay, they are valid and understandable in their own right and their own setting. So viewed as a meta-framework, the basic principles apply across time and across cultures, but within this open-ended list of threat responses and functions allow for an indefinite number of locally and historically specific expressions of distress, all shaped by prevailing cultural meanings. Okay, so DSM has a big problem with this, and it has got a list of things that are called culture-bound syndromes. And there's a lot of time has been wasted, for example, asking rather pointless questions like, is this really a form of schizophrenia? Or is this really a strange form of depression? Or what are those kind of questions? And of course, from a PTM perspective, all expressions of distress are culture-bound. There's no such thing as an expression of distress that isn't to some extent culture-bound. So the idea of some so-called syndromes being culture-bound is nonsensical. But at the same time, we think that the framework actually encourages us to look at certain expressions of distress that are less common from a kind of diagnostic Western perspective with respect. Okay, so here's an example that is listed in, I think it's in DSM-4, spirit possession. Very, very puzzling to the people who put together DSM. What do we do with spirit possession? What is this about? Is sometimes seen as equivalent to the psychiatric concepts of psychosis or dissociative disorder. And there is a version found in northern Uganda where civil war has resulted in widespread brutality in the abduction and forced recruitment of children as soldiers. In this phenomenon, young people report that their identity has been taken over by the malevolent ghost of a dead person. Sen has been found to be associated with high levels of war trauma and with abduction, and the spirit was often identified as someone the abductees had been forced to kill. So I think you'll get my point if I say we could understand this within the power threat meaning framework without having to call it schizophrenia or psychosis or impose any other Western diagnostic category on it. Does that make sense? So, as you may well know, there's a kind of something called the global mental health movement at the moment, which is a kind of, I would say, a very regrettable international movement to try and export diagnostic categories across the globe to cultures that don't currently necessarily think of distress in those ways. I think this is a very regrettable thing, and we're not saying, oh, well, let's export the power threat meaning framework instead. What we are saying is we need to have respect for the many culturally different ways of expressing and healing distress, and we have at least as much to learn from them as they do from us, if we want to think about it a bit stereotypically in terms of different models. Okay. So, the patterns help us to draw up personal, group and social narratives that restore meaning and agency, and along this have the potential to create hope, rebuild relationships and promote social action. And we don't want to lose sight of the following aspects. If we use the PTM framework to support our narrative making, our meaning making, inside services, outside services, one-to-one with peer support, however we might want to use it, we would hope that the narratives will have these characteristics, which are sometimes missed out of more traditional understandings and even, dare I say it, of more traditional psychological formulations. So we'd hope that such a narrative would include an awareness of the entrapping effect of the dominant narrative of psychiatric diagnosis, the contradictions in combining psychiatric diagnostic narratives with psychosocial ones. They don't add up together, they actually contradict each other. We don't need the first ones. The role of social discourses, as we've already discussed, and how those discourses can support the imposition of others' meanings, the impacts of coercive, legal and economic power, the nature and impact of power inequalities in psychiatric settings, the prevalence of abuse of interpersonal power within relationships, the role of ideological power as expressed through the multiple meanings that we've talked about so far. We also hope that a PTM perspective would encourage a narrative to have awareness of the following: the mediating role of biologically based threat responses, which of course are important. This is not an approach that rejects the role of biology. It depends what kind of role we ascribe to it. The importance of function over symptom or specific problem, the role of power resources in shaping threat responses, culture-specific meanings and forms of expression, self-help and social action along with or instead of professional intervention, the importance of group and community narratives to support the healing and reintegration of the social group, recognition of the personal and provisional nature of all narratives and the need for sensitivity and respect in supporting their development and expression, an overall message that is normalising, not pathologizing. You are experiencing an understandable reaction to threats and difficulties. Many others in the same circumstances have felt the same. That's a lot to take in, but you can have the slides later if you want to think about that further. I'm going to show you just a tiny, tiny edited version of what one of the patterns looks like, just to finish off, and you have the full version in the overview in your pack. So this is a tiny snapshot of one of the general patterns that we've provisionally called, let's say, surviving rejection, entrapment and invalidation. So you can read that for yourselves. You can see, it's quite broad and inclusive, and it may be you'll want to develop, versions of patterns within these general patterns in due course. But nevertheless, all the general patterns are based on a very extensive amount of evidence, which is summarised in Appendix 1 of the main document. And it is our belief that, looked at in the right way, the evidence that we currently use to try and support diagnostic models actually supports much more strongly this kind of pattern-based, meaning-based model. So we see these patterns as being evidence-based. So that is the general theme of that particular pattern. And each of the general patterns is associated with typical, this is not, these are not definitive patterns, these are suggestions, but common meanings are, as we can see there, common threat responses, and of course, in every case, the more disabling aspects of the threat responses can be countered by the more positive use of power and sources of protection. So one of the purposes of these general patterns is partly, we hope, to provide some of the sense of validation that people sometimes say they get from having a diagnosis. Well, it's enabled me to meet other people who share the same experiences. So a sense of I'm not alone with this. This is actually a relatively common way of responding to a particular constellation of threats, and I'm not alone with this. It's understandable. It makes sense. It's not just about me. That's one purpose. The other purpose, I suppose, could be to kind of help people think a bit more about, well, I wonder if that also applies to me. I wonder if that also applies to me. So a number of purposes, and we look forward to developing the patterns and their details a bit further.
Lucy actually came and talked at our local social work conference earlier in the week, and social workers, you could hear a pin drop. Social workers are incredibly excited about this. It makes a huge amount of sense. We've sort of muddled on through our training thinking that, there's a medical model, but we work to the social model. Without that being beautifully articulated, what this does is it just creates a framework that makes sense to many social workers. Not saying there aren't lots of social workers that are also quite medically minded. Fantastic. So what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes or so is just talk about what this new model means for access to resources, as it particularly thinking about social care, housing, and crucially money through welfare benefits. What does it mean? And so I'm starting with this. Does anyone know what that fish is? It's a red herring. Slightly, I think we are slightly asking, as it goes on, we're probably asking the wrong question. And this slide actually serves two purposes, because the other thing is, the way that social policy thinks about diagnosis is very much the same way that a fish thinks about water, as in it doesn't generally. It doesn't. So the diagnosis is interesting. We'll explore this as we go along. So, let's move on. So the reason it's a red herring, first of all, say this is purely hypothetical. we're at this stage. This is the launch of a new framework. This is hypothetical. There are no current attempts to move away from diagnostic categories. But what we are saying is this framework was just there are already ways, and there could be additional ways of preserving people's rights to welfare and services whilst avoiding the disadvantages of receiving a diagnosis. So what we're saying is two things. First of all, the current welfare net, it's often thought of as a net. I don't know if that's okay, but that is the way it's thought of, as a way to catch people who are troubled. It's not based on specific diagnoses. Let's just say that again. It is not based on specific diagnoses. Absolutely not. Second point is that decisions about rights and entitlements are social policy decisions. They're based on social constructs. What that means is anything is possible with political will and all that leads to that. So, as we know now, we have a system that is diagnostically driven. It's quite possible to have a social policy context which is taking money away from people. There's no link. We can do what we want with social policy. That's what they're saying. This is early stages. Everything is possible if it can be agreed. So, let's just look closely about what we might like to call this welfare net of entitlements and rights as well as them. How is it created? Okay, so there's some detail here. So that's a very busy slide. So we think about it a bit at a time. So thinking about social care, so we're thinking about now about the Care Act. How do people get entitlements through the Care Act? So the construct really that's used is the idea of mental impairment or illness. So basically, you have this initial qualifying thing, and then that leads to the next stages, which is, are there outcomes in your life that you can't achieve, and to what extent is not achieving those outcomes impacting significantly on your well-being? There's lots of weasel legal words there in the end, which will then get defined through case law about whether people will or won't get things. But the crucial thing is that at the beginning, there is a basic qualifying construct, which is that you have a mental impairment or illness. Now, that is not further defined, except to say it's the usual understanding of the word. So diagnosis is not referenced. We're talking about very crude categories of mental impairment and illness. If we think about welfare, so what you've got is a much hated process in terms of work capability assessments that are based on health conditions, illnesses, disabilities. Again, there's no reference to specific diagnoses. These are broad constructs. And then if we think about more disability benefits, so we're thinking about PIPs, then the constructs then are about long-term health conditions or disabilities. So then you would take that construct, first of all, it's a qualifying thing, and then people don't think about it very much because it's the water. So there's this thing, how much is this thing impacting on your day-to-day functioning, difficulty with mobility, whatever. So that's how it works. Just to keep going, you all right? Okay. So, are you all excited by this framework, by the way? Yeah. How do you feel? How do you feel? I mean, I think it's good to think about feelings a bit more. So, homelessness. I don't know how much people know about how homelessness legislation works. So basically, if you're homeless, have you got a local connection? Are you in priority need? To be in priority need, you have to be vulnerable. Now, vulnerable due to old age, ancient language, mental illness, handicap. So some idea that you're less able to fend for yourself than an ordinary person. Again, these are very crude constructs. No one is talking about that you have to have schizophrenia. No one is even talking about diagnosis in any way whatsoever. It's just these crude constructs. The other thing just to think about is about rights as well as entitlements. And that rights are very much based on the idea of disability. So we've got what was called the Disability Discrimination Act, merged into the Equalities Act. So disability is based on physical or mental impairment. And then interestingly, that is not further defined. So there's an assumption that mental impairment, everyone knows what that is. It's the water. We know what it is. And so these are rights that we really don't want to be doing anything to be taking any of this away. So whatever we do, whatever we call this mental distress, whatever we call it, we want people to be accessing what they need. We don't want to be nothing lost. So that's how it is. So you'll see that the net is woven from these crude constructs: mental impairment, disability, mental illness, mental health condition. Now they're used interchangeably without further definition, as if they kind of mean the same thing. So there's lots of assumptions are made. So there we go. So there's no reference to a specific diagnosis. It's a broad qualifying social construct, crucially, which is confirmed by some kind of professional. So it's there or not. And then once that qualifying thing is there or not, if it's there, then there's another step. And that's how it works, basically, crudely. So if we're going to lose the DSM mindset, if we're going to move to, I've written it down, patterns of embodied meaning-based threat responses to the negative operation of power. If we're going to start talking about that, and so there's a person. So I don't think we're saying they've got a mental impairment. I don't think everything we said, so that's not the language that we want to use. So this person is outside the net. So what do we do? How do we think about that? Well, there's three broad ways. So first of all, we could not change anything in the legislation. I'll talk that through. We could make the net bigger, so we could use existing constructs but amend the definition, or we could create a whole new net based on new constructs. So as we move down that list of, again, let's just stress, this is hypothetical. We're exploring this. But as you move down the net, everything requires more work in terms of legislation, but it involves less compromise from the model. So, no change. I guess quite a few of you work in mental health services now, and I'm guessing as you're here, that quite a few of you already are thinking in non-diagnostic ways about the people you work with. So within that system, the people that you work with, I'm sure you're assisting them to access resources that they need. So how do you do that? Well, you work in a pragmatic way, as we all do. And that's because we're using the fact that this is assumed. So if someone has been admitted to hospital and is about to be discharged, they've been in a psychiatric hospital, when you link up with the local authority thinking about a Care Act assessment, you don't have to say that they're mentally ill. You don't have to say they have a mental impairment, which is what you would need to say. You don't have to say it because it's assumed. That's how it works. So there's an unquestioned assumption that someone who is receiving a service from a mental health team has a mental impairment. And if you send something that is professionally endorsed, that generally works at the moment. No one has... The benefit officers aren't looking at saying, has someone got schizophrenia? They're not doing that. If a psychiatrist who is psychologically minded has written in saying something about there's a pattern of embodied meaning-based threat response to the negative operation of power, therefore they cannot work, well, that's no one's going to do anything. It's going to go through the system in the normal way. So we are all doing this at the moment. So that's the first reassuring thing I want to say. So this is a little bit of this is about reassurance. Okay. Second option, we can make the net bigger. To understand that, it's about keeping some constructs. So you could, for example, and this is very complex, obviously, this isn't worked through, we could keep the idea of disability. And we might want to do that because of wonderful things like the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We might want to think about how to have another construct that feeds into disability. Because if you think about the World Health Organization, maybe we're more comfortable with their definition of impairment. One of the few places that impairment is actually further defined, where they talk about any loss or abnormality of psychological, physiological or anatomical structure or function. Of course, we might take issue with the word abnormality, but maybe that's workable with. Okay, so this is hypothetical, as you can tell. So the other thing is we might want to create a entirely new net, and you can see it's a much nicer looking net in the picture, isn't it? So, and so we might want to think about creating new constructs, for example, something like experiencing temporary, enduring, regularly occurring severe mental distress, maybe no suggestions of permanent illness, some idea that you're not always in remission, you can be well. and that this construct would then link in to then analysing, thinking about how people function, how people live their lives, the difficulties that they have. So you could create a whole new social policy based on new constructs. I think we're talking quite a long way in the future. This is hopeful. So, there you go. It's completely possible in a hypothetical way. We do it at the moment. There's lots of different ways of creating access to important resources without referring to mental impairment. So, however, what we've done really is we're thinking about deficits. We're thinking about people with mental distress still having to demonstrate humbly before powerful bodies how distressed they are in order to receive the basic things of life. And now, is that what we want to do? In some way you have to say you're different, you're lacking in some way, therefore you can have basic support or money. Now, we might want to think, and that's what, I mean, at the beginning maybe we're asking the wrong question, is what kind of social policy follows from this model? What kind of social policy response? So if we're thinking about the action of power and threat and response to this in this difficult world that everyone lives in, what kind of social policy would we want? And that's one of the things that social workers find most exciting about this model. There's lots of things that are exciting. But this idea that you restore the link between distress and social justice is hugely significant. So you might want to think about how all citizens, maybe we should say, should have access to basic resources without the humiliating requirement of needing to demonstrate impairment. I'm not saying universal basic income is obviously, I'm not saying that's the answer necessarily, but it's the kind of thing that people might want to think of. We do live in a society where we think maybe everyone should be able to feed themselves without going to food banks, for example. Maybe we should be thinking about what we think are the basic dignities that a human being should have. So we'd be thinking about more rights-based modelling, might link to ideas that are around, such as people who have asset-based community development. We might be thinking about people's strengths, not about people as people with needs who need to be looked after in any kind of way. So this is Cormac Russell, and he said this, which I really like. So the challenge is how to build communities of hospitality that have a genuine place of welcome for people who've been pushed farthest to the edge with their gifts at the centre. Quite like that. So in summary, this is purely hypothetical. There's no current attempts to move away from diagnostic categories in the welfare rights related systems. The current system is not based on specific diagnoses. It's quite possible to create a system based on alternative social constructs or work with what exists in a pragmatic way. And then finally, do we want, given the wonderful work that's gone on here about thinking about people in a different kind of way, do we want a system where people have to demonstrate how much they are suffering in order to be objects of charity who could then receive their basic human rights? Yeah. Thank you.
I'm Dave Harper, I'm another member of the team, and I'm going to be talking about some implications of the framework for research and also public mental health. I don't know how many researchers there are in the audience. One of the things that we found, particularly in writing the longer version of the document, is there's quite a lot of pros and cons to different approaches to research. I mean, we couldn't have written the document without a lot of the research that is out there, but each time we were drawing on certain kinds of studies, it was clear there were some pros and some cons to each of these different studies. So whatever we do in terms of the future, in terms of research, we don't just need to focus on one or two kind of methods. We need to be focusing on a much broader range of questions, a much broader range of methods. It's quite a mixed audience here today. There's professionals here, there's some academics, there's a lot of people with lived experience as well, and I've got quite a limited amount of time, so I'm sorry if some of these concepts and ideas are unfamiliar to some people. It would take quite a lot of time to explain some of them, so hopefully you'll kind of bear with that a little bit. There's a bit more explanation in the hard copy of the document that you've got today, and on Monday the fuller version of the main document will be available on the web, and there's a bit more discussion in there. I mean, most of the sections, particularly the ones on social context, for instance, are based a lot on the research that's out there already. So the main problem we've got with research at the moment is so much of it is based on diagnostic categories. And if you talk to most researchers, most of them will accept privately, sometimes publicly, that these diagnostic categories around functional psychiatric diagnoses are problematic. And that really they're having to do the research using the categories that they've got, because that's what you need to do to get published in some of the leading psychiatric journals. The so-called high impact factor journals virtually kind of require people to give, require researchers to give ICD or DSM diagnosis to people. And this leads to a kind of curious situation, because that's the research that gets published in those leading journals. Then when groups like the National Institute of Health and Clinical Excellence, the NICE, which is the kind of body in this country that looks at the research that's out there and then recommends which are the best forms of therapy, best forms of help for people in their documents. When they look out there, if you look at their NICE guidance documents, the full version of the document, not the ones that the middle managers in the NHS tend to focus on, but the actual full document, most of them are quite critical about diagnostic categories. The guidelines on depression, for instance, criticise the concept of depression in the introduction to the main document. This is kind of one of the kind of weird things that people think that NICE basically shores up the diagnostic system, but actually in a lot of these documents they're quite critical about some of the diagnostic frameworks and also some of the research. But NICE then says, but the problem is that the research out there uses these categories, so we've got to use these categories. And then NICE uses those categories, and then people in services that are increasingly structured around diagnostic categories, and those services restructure their services alongside those categories. So we've got now streams of kind of psychosis kinds of services and emotional services in child and adolescent mental health. We've got services that are more streamed around particular clusters of problems. And then research funders, when researchers, funders are thinking about the best kinds of research to fund, they're looking at things like the NICE guidelines. What are the ways in which the research should be structured? So you get this kind of curious situation where nobody really thinks these diagnostic categories are any good, but everybody ends up using them. Researchers quite often don't think they're very useful. NICE doesn't think they're very useful. And services don't really work very well structured around those kind of categories. So why are they still here? It's weird, isn't it? Basically, nobody wants to make the first move. Researchers don't want to stop using them because then they're not going to get published in journals. NICE feels that what other research would they look at if they weren't looking at stuff structured by diagnostic categories? So we need somebody to start increasing more pressure for alternatives that most people think are actually more reliable and more valid than functional diagnostic categories. So really what I want to do in this talk now is to say, let's try and do this. And actually professional organisations like the British Psychological Society, a division of clinical psychology, other bodies are perhaps in a better position than most to kind of advocate for this kind of change, which is great. It's great that the DCP funded the production of this discussion document. And what we need to do now is to kind of follow this up with a bit more action and maybe a bit more campaigning and a bit more pressure to bear on some of these different bodies. And I'm going to be giving some kind of examples of the kinds of actions that people could be taking. But it's worth just kind of pointing out that lots of researchers kind of use these categories and then say, well, we don't really believe in them. We're going to actually focus on more specific problems, but we're going to give diagnoses anyway because that's what's kind of expected. And this kind of inadvertently, even though they may not intend this to happen, this inadvertently kind of reinforces the use of diagnostic constructs. And as Lucy kind of said at the introduction to the day, diagnosis appears to do lots of different things, and we know it actually appears to do lots of different things. It does them all quite badly, but it does them kind of, because it gives the appearance of doing quite a number of different things, that's one of the reasons that it continues. And the same is true in research. So, as I say, lots of people feel that it doesn't really work for research either. And the problem is there isn't going to be a single alternative to diagnostic categories in research. But the main thing is that we need to maybe just get a bit clearer about the questions that we're asking, because diagnosis kind of gets in the way. It obstructs research progress rather than facilitates it. I really shouldn't have been shouting at everybody to come in after tea and coffee, because I think I've done it. So we're not going to have a single alternative, and we need to maybe have a bit more of a clearer think about what are the questions that we really need to ask in research. One of the things that hopefully has kind of come through the first part of the morning is we really need to be focusing much more on specific experiences. So global diagnostic categories that are really heterogeneous, that cover lots and lots of different things. Really, although people say they can convey information, they're a shorthand description, it doesn't really describe anything. Because most people, you can have two people with the same diagnosis and totally different experiences, totally different experiences of distress, and you always need to add on, or somebody will always say, well, what kind of problems do you have, even if that's your diagnosis. So what we need to be doing in research, and this is, people like Richard Bentle are very much focused on this kind of approach, what he calls a complaints-based approach. Within a medical framework, people call a symptom-based approach, but actually focusing more on particular constructs. So hearing voices, for instance. But also we need to perhaps move that a little bit further, because that's perhaps a bit less uncontroversial in clinical psychology. Another kind of less uncontroversial. It's probably not very controversial. Less controversial kind of issue is the idea about experiences of distress lying along the continuum. So as kind of Lucy said all along this morning, that we're not saying that there is some separate category between people who are normal in the general population and people who are in mental health services. So we need to be thinking about these experiences lying along the continuum. We need to be focusing on specific kinds of experiences, and that can be actually politically quite useful. So the notion of hearing voices is very useful precisely because it's not using medicalised language. It's quite descriptive, and it's also something to organise around. So it kind of addresses that question of, if you've got a kind of problem, what do you put into Google? If you're not going to put in depression, or if you're not going to put in schizophrenia. So we do need new concepts. And this is where I kind of, think we need to push things a little bit more, following through the implications of this morning. I don't think it's enough to just think about specific experiences or to see them as lying along the continuum. We also need to be thinking about concepts that make the link between our present experience and the things that have happened to people. So we continually need to be thinking about constructs that can't just be individualised, reified as just lying inside somebody's head that have come out of nowhere. We need to be thinking about concepts that make those links clearer to people, that don't obscure them in the way that were mentioned in John's and Mary's slides. That it can be very easy to obscure the things that have happened to people. And there are actually lots of reliable and valid constructs that kind of do that. I mean, the classic psychological notion of learned helplessness, it was a very good demonstration of how repeated kind of negative things happening to people can leave people feeling very, very helpless. So, and that's, again, it's quite a simple idea, and it can be demonstrated quite well. So psychologists and other professionals, other researchers need to be thinking, what are the other kinds of concepts? Because as Phil just said, we need a new conceptualisation, not just in terms of welfare, we need it in terms of research. We need to be thinking differently about things. We need to be escaping, as Mary's called it, the DSM mindset. And we're going to need to use a range of different methods to do that. Now, obviously, researchers are just a huge area to cover in quite a short amount of time. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples. There's a bit more discussion about these in the hard copy of the document that you've been given today. But one of the things that people often say is, well, if you're trying to move to a kind of non-medical way of doing things, how could you do outcome studies of different kinds of therapies? You've got to use kind of symptom rating scales. Well, it's not necessarily the case, is it? I mean, you could have therapies that are evaluated in terms of how clearly they're helping people move towards goals. We don't have to say all numbers are bad. We don't have to think all quantitative methods are bad. We can be thinking about using them in a slightly different way. We can also, for instance, in solution-focused therapy, people use rating scales. They can be quite useful. Numerical scales can be quite useful in comparing change over time. So I don't think it's about whether scales are bad. It's what are the scales about, and what are the underlying constructs in those scales. We could also think about particular experiences of distress slightly differently. So in psychology, there's this thing called the Shapiro's personal questionnaire, which is a way of using a kind of rating system that is based on somebody's own description and explanation of their mental health problem, the kinds of distress that they've got. So we can actually kind of still use numbers, but have them focused on problems in the way that people have explained them themselves. We could also be thinking more about process issues in psychotherapy, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. One of the other things that we can do is think differently about therapeutic efficacy as well, because one of the problems, and this is not a new kind of idea, but one of the problems in this area is the use of what people have called the drug metaphor in investigating therapy. The kind of idea that therapy is like a drug, so like you can give somebody a drug and you can measure change over time, and it's divorced from anything else. I mean, that's actually not true of drugs either, where we know all about the kind of placebo effect. But it's even more so in psychological therapy. And all the studies of psychological therapy have shown, we can't get away from the placebo effect. You can't. It's pretty obvious to people that they're having therapy because they're talking to somebody. Most of the studies, even where they have some kind of comparison, those people are trained therapists. It's quite difficult to get away from these facts. So rather than thinking that this is a problem, maybe we need to have much more focus on things like the placebo effect, which is a slightly patronising way of talking about building relationships with people. We need more focus perhaps on less on the small marginal differences between different therapies, and more focus on some of the kind of common factors, underlying factors. As other people in the field have talked about this, is what if we stopped thinking about things as a drug treatment and thought about therapy as a socially situated healing practice, so actually putting much more focus on the social and the relational. We need much more focus on different ways of thinking about distress. So we've been talking this morning already about making and keeping the links with threat and adversities in people's life. And although there is some kind of research out there on this, it's in the very, very early stages. So we need much more in this area. So if there are trainee researchers in the room, if there are trainee clinical psychologists, other trainee professionals, service user researchers, we need much more ideas in this kind of area. So I want to inspire people to be thinking, how can we think about distress differently? How is it affected by the social and cultural context in which people are located, and how can we think about those things and look at people in those contexts? How do people talk about distress? We've got into a situation in Western societies now where psychological jargon has become the kind of popular argot. So we're starting to lose some of these older ways of talking about problems, things like thinking too much, although they're still there, but people are increasingly starting to use psychological jargon, which unfortunately can inadvertently take away from people's life experiences. I'm aware I'm kind of lagging behind time here, but there are kind of lots of links that we need to be making with other disciplines. So this should not just be a psychology kind of thing. This should be drawing on a whole range of different disciplines, including disciplines that are looking at culture, that are much better at looking at the social context. We need to be looking at people from a range of different cultural backgrounds. I mean, most of the theories that we look at and discuss in the document are largely Westernized concepts. We know Eurocentrism is a major problem in psychology and psychiatry, so again, we need culturally appropriate ways of thinking about distress in all of its different forms. We could also be linking much more with service user researchers who are influenced by the social model of distress. We could be thinking more about making links with MAD studies workers and so on. Right, so I'm just going to race very quickly through a couple of things that we need to be doing in terms of research. So we need to be really challenging research funders to change their incentives. There's a much more of a focus, if you look at for instance, the funding history of the MRC, there's much more focus on biochemical, biogenetic research, which is decades and decades away from producing anything that's likely to be a help to people, whereas psychosocial approaches, where there's much more evidence, it's very difficult to get those funded. There's much less funding for prevention than there is for research into etiology, even though, as we've kind of demonstrated, or hopefully demonstrated today, rubbish in, rubbish out. If your theories and constructs are not very good, then you're not going to be able to find the etiology of something. What is it you're trying to find the etiology of? And we continually have promises that there's going to be some great biological breakthroughs, and yet people are continually saying, oh, well, the brain's a bit more complicated than we thought it was. Well, no shit. So, maybe we need to be just thinking a bit more carefully before we start spending millions and millions of pounds of public money on things that turn out to be rather speculative and a bit more complicated. We need to be thinking about journals. Journals have a responsibility here. Why are they promoting the use of diagnostic categories that, for instance, we know that the interrater reliability in the DSM-5 field trials of schizophrenia was less than 50%. Right, less than half the time, psychiatrists could agree on schizophrenia, which is one of the kind of foundation diagnoses. Why on earth is the American Journal of Psychiatry promoting the use of these categories? This is unscientific. It's obstructing research progress. Similarly, NICE, even though it doesn't have a role as a research funder, it could be maybe making moves to suggest that researchers take on different kinds of approaches. And professional bodies could show much more leadership in this area. And lastly, on public mental health. It's very clear from what we've kind of said so far this morning that there's a lot of life adversities that affect people. There's lots of things that have threatened people in their lives and have impacted on them and caused them distress. So we need to be doing something about that. And we have quite contradictory public policies at the moment. On the one hand, lots of mental health service leaders. We have lots of policy documents at a quite a senior level and from the government saying that we need to be moving towards a preventive approach. And yet local authorities, which is where public health departments are located, have been cut much more than the NHS. There have been cuts to public health budgets. Public health practitioners feel much more kind of marginalised than they did before. So we need to be making changes in this. We need to be not just waiting for people to develop problems and then intervene at an early stage, which is really what most prevention work is in mental health services. It's not really prevention, it's early detection, early intervention. What about the stage before that? What's so-called primary prevention? Actually trying to address things before people develop problems. Trying to prevent those adversities happening. What are the kind of research methods, what are the kind of policy incentives and initiatives that would stop that happening? How could we reduce the amount of child abuse that's going on? So rather than increasing funding for child protection services, we need to be doing that, but how do we reduce child abuse? This is a major kind of social problem, and yet it seems that there's not a lot of research going into what you would need to do. What are the range of initiatives that you need to do? So we need to be focusing much more on prevention, and we need to be thinking much more broadly. So rather than just focusing in quite a medicalised way, we need to be thinking about what are the range of things that help people address adversities or avoid adversities. One of the things is increasing their power. So as kind of Mary listed before, all the different ways in which power can affect people in their lives. So how can we change policy so that people have more power, so that they have access to education, they have access to employment, that they have more control over their environment, they can escape if they're in situations of adversity, they can build trust, we can build collective solidarity amongst people. And this may then, just I'll end on this point, quite a broad point, but maybe we also need to be thinking about how we structure our society. There's actually a great paper about how Western society is a hazard to mental health, a hazard to public health. Materialist consumerism, competitive individualism. There's lots of public health practitioners, there's lots of legitimate researchers argues that these are actual public health hazards. So this is quite a kind of broad point. I'm not going to suggest that we should immediately go out and man the barricades and start a civil war. Although that wouldn't be a bad thing. But really we need to be thinking much more broadly about mental health. We need to really make some change in society. We know there's lots and lots of research about the links between social inequality and mental health. So we need to be doing something about that. It's not just an incidental side thing, it's one of the core reasons why, one of the causes of the causes, as we say, of distress. So I'll end there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dave. This is Dave 2, Dave P, Dave Pilgrim. It has caused confusion at times in our group. So I'm going to pursue a little bit of the themes that Dave's picked up, also some of the matters that John raised earlier. John and I worked together on this section, so in the document itself there's quite a lot of terminology, so I'm going to pick those points up again. The first thing to say when we come back to the matter of language and meaning is that we're not just talking about diagnosis, but a whole medical discourse. And in many ways, this framework is a fundamental challenge to that. It's not the first time it's happened. In many ways, the framework is bringing together previous work. But we do have to acknowledge that at the beginning. It is challenging to a medical discourse in terms of all the languages used. But, for instance, symptom, Dave mentioned Richard Bentall's work on single symptoms. It's problematic, but you can see why he's doing it, but you still use the word symptom. That would be an example. And language serves a social purpose. I was thinking yesterday about, well, what does language do? And I suppose in very broad terms, it does two things. It allows us to bear witness to ourselves and our situation and our past and our present and our future and those of other people. We can talk about life through language. We are witnesses to our own existence. And that we're talking about reality and events. We're talking about things that happen to us. The first question, what's happened to you? Well, that's in a sense reporting. It's bearing witness to ourselves. But the second is that then we overlay that with a set of meanings which can shift over time. And again, Lucy raised that in the first part, which is really important, that we reconstrue things over time, that we don't think in the same way now that we did yesterday or last year or 20 years ago, etc. So we're people who are fluid in our meaning attribution. Both are true at the same time, that language does both of these things. And actually, I think by the time we're sort of 6 or 7, we get that. Most people actually just do that. You don't need to have a PhD in linguistics to do this. You just do it as a human being. Okay, and somehow, diagnosis robs us of that basic human capacity. Because what it does is it takes one narrow way of using language, which is based upon the professional's view of understanding, to elicit symptoms, to then to be put into a box set by the practitioner. That's how language is used. It's a very narrow way, it's an extremely restrictive way. I think this framework is simply saying, let's get back to using language in its ordinary sense, which is very fluid, very open-textured, in an open system, and most of us as human beings can just do it. We don't need schooling in it, we just do it because we're human. That's what we do. And this will lead to resistance, though. This is the point, that there's an investment in this language, not just in the medical profession, but in the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, using diagnostic-related groups, and this idea of magic bullets. So there's a lot of investment, material investment in this, including in policy formation. In the European Union, for instance, they only talk about policy in terms of what they call DRGs, diagnostic-related groups. So this approach will blow those apart if we take it seriously, and it picks up Dave's point then about how do we research differently. Okay. So if we are going to use an alternative phrases, we might use distress, problems, emotional difficulties, unusual experiences, troubled or troubling behaviour. I think there has been a tendency in the past to actually reduce everything to distress, which I have complained about in the group, because I actually think the wide discourse, medical discourse of psychiatry, doesn't just cover distress. It includes people, for instance, who don't experience distress. It includes people who distress other people. So we're talking about quite a complex business, the mental health industry. It's not one thing, So if we're going to do this differently, we have got to be honest about that linguistic complexity, which points to social relationships and transgression of rules, failures in roles, all sorts of things are going on, which are currently put into diagnostic boxes and are psychiatrised. But if we're not going to do that, we've got to think about them in an honest and alternative way. So it's complicated. We've got to reflect complex reality in an open system as language. It's not possible just to see this as an alternative sort of slot-rattling exercise. We can't just exchange one set of languages for another. Otherwise, we're replacing one set of stupid concepts with another set of stupid concepts. So we've got to actually respect ourselves as having sophistication and complexity, and we've got to respect difference in the way we understand the world and ourselves. So there were moves, some of you will know this, there were moves to replace certain diagnosis by introducing trauma. For example, borderline personality disorder, to replace it by some sort of chronic trauma condition, which you could argue is a step in the right direction, but it still doesn't really expand the points that are in this framework. It's just really replacing one concept with another in a slightly preferable way, if you like, because at least it embeds the notion that something has happened to people, but it's still very restrictive as a diagnosis. So we might decide to use the word mad, for instance. I got pulled up on Facebook whether I could use the word mad, and I thought, actually, I think I can use the word mad. I think that's all right. Because it's an ordinary word. Although what I mean by mad will depend on the context. It's all about contextualising language, which is a point, again, that is embedded in this framework. It's about context is all important and the way we use language. Language intrinsically is not necessarily offensive because you use it. It's the way you use it. But I think some words are just intrinsically offensive just because they're misleading. So we then might go on to these functional descriptions or behavioural descriptions, hearing voices, having suspicious thoughts, feeling suicidal, just descriptions of experiences that people have, which, by the way, everybody can use. You don't need a medical trainer to use these, because these are ordinary human experiences. Even the notion of hearing voices, which by definition, as was pointed out, is considered out of the ordinary, actually people can imagine that. I think there's some very interesting questions about when people say they hear voices in their head. And I don't really know what that means. I always thought an hallucination was something outside there. But okay, let's have a discussion about what a voice is then. But at least we're starting to have a genuine discussion about the nature of auditory hallucinations or voices. We're not actually just saying it's a symptom of schizophrenia, end of matter. Taking neuroleptics and you'll stop hearing voices. We've got to stop that logic, I suppose. So these remain quite loose terms, open the contestable terms. They're open to debate. We should debate them, what we mean by voice. I think we should do that, that's fine. And in fact, the notion of hearing voices is probably more productive, actually, as an exercise, as a research exercise, than just going down the diagnostic route of the past 15 years, probably longer than 15 years, actually, isn't it? Okay, so, just reinforcing the point that Lucy made. Verbs, not nouns. We have to talk about what people do rather than what people have. Because actually it does ultimately matter. You can actually have as many strange experiences as you like. It's the way that you act that will get you into difficulties. David Cooper once said, if you must go mad, do so discreetly. And I think he was right, because I think ultimately it's conduct that matters, isn't it? And how we interpret what conduct means. So the doing bit is actually really significantly involved, not just for scientific reasons in our terms, but also socially and politically. It's what people do that matters at the end of it all. And then this then leads us to be able to talk about notions like rejection, entrapment, and invalidation, because we can capture these behaviours in general patterns which refer to the person and their context. And so, ordinary language version, grieving, coming to terms with abuse. These are again just ordinary words we can use. Right. So, what are the ordinary words? I think Dave mentioned an important point, which actually, don't forget that medicalisation and medical terminology, the medical discourse, has now infiltrated the whole thing. People talking about having clinical depression. So, somebody said, I've got clinical depression, for example. Heart sink moment last night, watching news at 10, talking about personality disorder. People having personality disorder. This permeates the whole way that we think in society about how we talk about. Abraham de Swan, the sociologist, called this proto-professionalisation system, the way that in Western societies we tend to take on board medicalised concepts and take them as givens, and we start to believe them, in the truth of them. And we develop our own personal expertise in them, because we can now say, I've got clinical depression. So it gives you a sort of authority. But if we're not going to do that, should we return then to much more humble but maybe accurate ordinary words like misery, despair, desperation, etc. Just ways of being which actually reflect the human condition. And the term compassion has been contested. That's got a long history, and no doubt lots of you will have different views about that. The fact that, for instance, in the United States, they preferred the term ex-patients and patients movement rather than users because of its drug connotation, reflecting again even the context, cultural context of how you would use the word patient or user will be offensive or inoffensive depending where you are. These are things we've just got to keep talking about, getting clear. Peter Beresford and his colleagues talk about, therefore, the need to introduce what he calls sensitive diversity language. Just let's accept that we probably will talk in different ways at different times. And we sort of respect it unless somebody's being really, really offensive and actually using a term that you find horrible. Think, well, why are they using that term? And can we tolerate it if we sort of broadly know what they're talking about so we can have a conversation? So that sensitive diversity, I think, is important and to reflect this point about situations and contexts all the time. So, professional language versus personal choices. A position we've adopted in the group is that in their own lives, people should always be free to make their own language choices. And the point being here, that if you've only got one form of language, which is diagnostic language, how can you then, when you're in a service, either as a professional or as a service user, how can you say, I don't want to talk about it in that way, I want to talk about it in this way? You know, it pushes us all down this monochromic way of looking at the world by only using diagnostic language, and therefore it is important to open this up. And there's the question of exclusion. There's a whole question around whether services exclude people. Okay. So, if it's acknowledged that psychiatric diagnoses are not valid or even evidence-based, then this is what we say in the overview. This is in your document, so you can read this. They're not valid at any level, either scientifically or ethically, even though some people still find them personally useful or socially acceptable. So what's the implication? Changing, it makes people scared, it makes some people excited. So when people say, how you feel, you go, oh great, yeah. So I don't think necessarily make you scared, it can make you excited. So it's a radical step to make, and it's something, I think the feel from the audience is that what is mostly you want to do that, and hopefully the framework is going to do that. And so what I want to do now is I want to move to a different question, which is, I think, which is about services.
This is a very brief example which someone who's currently in the audience gave, I think. Jill, don't you think, here? Anyway, we had an unusual experience, which is a productive Twitter discussion. Jill posed the question, we want to rename our PD pathway suggestions, so I just thought I'd give you a very, very brief illustration of what happens when you start questioning language. So people immediately came up with some suggestions: complex trauma, trauma-informed therapy service, trauma liaison centre, etc. But that immediately raised a whole lot of other questions. What about people who don't identify as having a trauma? How do you define trauma anyway? Does this distinguish people who have been labelled PD from everybody else? Are such distinctions valid? If you had a trauma-informed service, would you even have a separate trauma pathway? And importantly, if it's still a PD service in all but name, how much of an improvement is it? And then the discussion moved on to think about what pathway is for. Maybe we want to get away from any kind of psychological or medical terms whatsoever. The healing network, integrated care. Perhaps we want to talk about where we want to end up. Rediscovery service, new perspectives, the listening centre. Are these specific enough? Well, they're not very specific, but actually does it matter? Are we actually offering what the name implies if we adopt some of these terms? And importantly, what are the service users use? What might the people prefer who are actually going to be using this service? So that's a 2-second example of what happens when you start to question diagnosis. It forces you to think. It forces you to think. There was no simple or easy answer. In fact, I don't know exactly what the service name currently is. and it won't be a universal choice. It will depend on different settings as to what people find helpful. But we need to start questioning language so that we start asking really profound and important questions about what we're doing, what we want to do and why, and what kind of changes we need to make in addition to the name. Thank you. And now we're all behaving rather characteristic today. I'm being very bossy. Peter has arrived 2 minutes before his talk. Peter and Kate Allsop.
Hi, my name's Kate Allsop. I've been a contributor on the project. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about service entry criteria and service access. So, okay, a commonly cited functional benefit of diagnosis is said to be a referral to services, which leads, of course, to looking at commissioning of those services. So, for instance, as part of my PhD research, clinicians I interviewed about their uses and views on diagnosis tended to say things like this. So even psychologists who don't typically use diagnosis as part of their clinical work often felt like they needed to frame people's difficulties in terms of diagnosis in order to have people's difficulties taken seriously and to be considered by services. But what we've done is we conducted systematic data collection using Freedom of Information requests to gather and analyse the service entry criteria for mental health trusts in the north of England, to really analyse what extent diagnosis is actually embedded within service entry criteria. And we do find examples of that, such as this service here. This is perhaps what people assume or expect to find, so kind of lists of diagnosis within entry criteria for services like this one. And a lot of services also use diagnosis within exclusion criteria. So apart from the fact that they frequently include personality disorder, despite this being no longer a diagnosis of exclusion, we also found that diagnosis in exclusion criteria are commonly used as a proxy for signposting to different services. So, for example, as an approximation of kind of different types of difficulties that might require a different team skill set. So one example might be IAPT, where Dave earlier was talking about in terms of research and NICE guidelines are very much diagnosis-led. And so, as you would expect, IAPT services often come with lists of diagnosis in terms of inclusion and exclusion. So exclusion might be things like psychosis, bipolar disorder, personality disorder. However, these diagnoses are generally used as an indication of severe and enduring mental health problems, or tied in with other exclusion criteria like higher levels of risk, for example. So it's not really about the diagnosis themselves, but what they're actually being used for. And crucially also, this research revealed that although, as you can see, some services, a number of services do explicitly use diagnosis as service entry criteria, there are kind of two things. One, these are generally broad groups of diagnoses, so like eating disorders, personality disorders. It's not about the specific diagnoses themselves. And those diagnostic labels again tend to act as proxies for certain levels of severity and different skill sets of staff teams. And second, really importantly, diagnoses alone weren't sufficient to indicate entry criteria. So qualifying statements were always needed in terms of further specifying what that service would or wouldn't include. Again, thinking about levels of severity, or for example, personality disorder services always explicitly said that needed to come with complex needs and significant risks associated in order to warrant having a specialist service. So just the diagnosis on its own isn't enough. And other qualifiers might be, for example, social or functional difficulties. And also the analysis revealed that, surprisingly perhaps, the largest group was not diagnostic services, but those that were driven by the needs of people using them. So, for example, that might range from kind of primary care services to up to secure services. And then still other, just a few, but some services do provide interventions that are problem specific, so specific difficulties but without necessarily using diagnoses. So it's like sexual problems, traumatic stress and so on. And some also supported specific life circumstances, so looking at particular social factors and demographic groups, so for example military veterans or homeless and traveller teams. So you can see that the inherent flexibility in local commissioning means that existing services do already use non-diagnostic approaches. So although diagnosis appears to be a kind of crucial factor within, or is often talked about as a crucial factor in terms of service entry, in practice they're actually neither necessary nor sufficient when used for service entry criteria. So that said, of course, the majority of services don't, in terms of their criteria, they don't look at types of threats or the context of those threat responses that we heard about this morning. So in order to kind of better assess the levels of need in terms of those within the population, I will hand over to Peter.
This, incidentally, is all Kate's work. It's just PhD supervisors always take credit because it's what we do. So as we were exploring these things, what Kate became clear was that people believed that diagnoses and, I guess, the disease model of psychiatry is necessary and that we're in some sort of chaos land if we don't use diagnoses, and yet it's not true. And yet the services are either specified, making reference to need, and talking about diagnosis, or in some cases just making reference to need. So that moved on to the other side of it, which is if you've got this culture of the disease model and symptom identification, diagnosis and treatment imbuing the system, and people apparently struggling to design services that are more flexible to people's needs. Do we actually know what people's needs are? And this led to Kate and I writing this little article for The Lancet Psychiatry. And what it reveals is, or what it talks about, is something that should be known already. It struck Kate, reading through these things, that there are these odd psychosocial codes in ICD-10. And then that sparked a flash of recognition in my mind, because ICD, being the World Health Organization's system for collecting everything that is a threat to human health, includes, for instance, a specific code for having been bitten by a parrot on a second or subsequent occasion. It even has injured by debris from a falling spacecraft as an explicit criterion. It includes everything, and it's already there. What's more interesting is when you look at it, this becomes quite pertinent to the stuff we're happening today. And in a sense, Kate and I are sending a slightly different message to some other people, in that we're saying there are backdoor or even trapdoor entries into the system to get need and the context of people's social lives into the system without too much struggle. So, for instance, homelessness exists in the ICD system. And not only that, but you can see it's a diagnostic code. Now, we need to be careful about language, Dave's point, because it's a code that is used for identifying a healthcare need. It is not a symptom of an illness vesting in the person. But what we have in ICD is a list where you can include homelessness. If you look carefully at this, now this is not a legal obligation upon local authorities or on NHS trusts, but look at what the World Health Organization says. This indicates a diagnosis for reimbursement purposes. In other words, healthcare professionals around the world are told that if somebody comes and says, I have healthcare needs because I am homeless, we are enabled to charge them for the services that we put in order to help them. It's there. I was about to swear, but I shouldn't because I'm in the quick. It's there in the system already. So then the question is, do people use it? And we're currently, Kate and I trying to collect data on this, and we teamed up with a local London psychiatrist who looked at this. And in the trust in which he works, he searched for us 26,000 case records who had ICD-10 diagnoses recorded. We need to look into this in much more detail. This is extremely patchy snapshot, and one of the things that you'll see is the numbers don't actually add up. For those that had a recorded ICD-10 diagnosis of a psychiatric condition, 24,000, so 92.3% had no social code attached to them. The codes exist. You can code for homelessness, you can code for poverty, you can code for spousal abuse, you can code for child abuse in childhood, you can code with insecure employment, you can code for disagreements with boss or employer. They're all listed in ICD-10. But on 92.3% of occasions there was no code. On 7% of occasions there was a recorded social code. This is purely speculation on our part, but we think that that's probably only Joe, and it's probably Joe recording the people in North London who are homeless, which is something he did quite a lot. So we suspect that's just him and his caseload. But there was only a social code recorded on 7% of occasions. What's even more interesting is that on 6.6% of those 7.7 occasions, when a social code was recorded, they didn't put down a psychiatric diagnosis. Now what that means is it's something that's common in the field of learning disabilities, which is diagnostic overshadowing. Once you've identified that somebody meets the criteria for ICD-10 major depressive disorder, you don't bother to record the social circumstances that led to that disorder. We can't prove that, but it fits entirely with that context. When you notice that somebody is homeless, because you're working in the mental health services, it makes perfect sense to say homeless, and then the secondary code is a psychiatric one. It works that way around, it doesn't work the other way around. So the message here that we think is the take-home message are three. One is, I think that, well, speaking for myself, I'm all in favour of radical rethinking of the ethos behind these issues. And part of that is in Kate's presentation, in that the ethos of diagnosis being necessary is imbued in the system, but it might not necessarily be true. The second message is there already exists within the structure of the World Health Organization's system the beginnings of a process. Now, it doesn't mean to say that we accept the diagnoses of so-called mental illnesses at face value, nor does it mean that we think that the current system for recording the social context of people's lives is adequate. But there's the window of an opportunity for looking at it. There is also the evidence that the systems available to us, to me, because I also work in the NHS, are not used in the way that they should be, and that's why we recommended that they could. And I suppose our conclusion is that as well as challenging the philosophical ethos of the way in which we go about business, we should probably go about trying to do some practical work on using the tools that are available to press for change where it's possible. And of course, to go back to this woman in the front row's comment, don't ask what's wrong with me, ask what's happened to me, and then I guess we've had a code of the ICD recording sheets because you can. Thank you.
So the power threat meaning framework was co-produced with the survivor members of the core team from the first meeting. So it wasn't something that Eleanor and I were kind of co-opted into at a later date. From the very beginning we were involved in that process, and it draws extensively from survivor literature and has benefited from numerous other survivor and service user contributions. In terms of the actual document, we consulted 8 service users and carers. They were invited, they were sent a brief outline of the framework and then invited via a one-to-one discussion to reflect really and give feedback on the framework and what they felt were the benefits and what they felt was potentially unhelpful. So again, this was a process we took very seriously. Something we were very mindful of is that we didn't want to produce a massive document that actually didn't relate to people's experiences and that they themselves didn't find helpful. So, you know, that consultation process was quite extensive, and the critiques that people made, we very much then sort of reabsorbed into the document and made adaptations accordingly. So their comments were used to refine the document, and also they were paid properly for their time. One of the things that happens a lot in mental health services is that people are asked to consult, and we think their time's not properly valued, so we ensure that people are properly paid for their time. as a respect for both their time, but also that these are painful issues to kind of go back over again and look at through a different lens. And for some people, they said, you know, one person in particular said that actually it's quite painful looking at this stuff, because if I'd been offered this alternative, it might have saved me years in the system, actually being further re-traumatised. So, you know, that was something we were very mindful of in interviewing people, both, you know, what was your impression of the document, what do you think about the framework, is this something that you would have found more helpful? But also for some people it brought up quite a lot of anger and sadness and grief, because they hadn't been offered this opportunity to think about their experiences and their difficulties. So we aimed for a range of backgrounds, as much as was permissible really, with a small group of people that we had, bearing in mind that we had quite limited resources. So we interviewed 4 men, 4 women. They were within an age range of 21 to 54. So we had 5 white British participants, 2 African Caribbean participants, and 1 non-British, which was unspecified for the purposes of the project. And the people that we consulted had a range of diagnoses. Some had been diagnosed in childhood and in adulthood, or both. And the diagnoses ranged from anxiety to schizophrenia, and a number of our consultants also talked about the fact that their diagnosis has been changed at different times. Most had not been exposed to what we would call critical perspectives, so we tried to select a group of people who would be open, but may not come with a whole set of assumptions, as much as one is able to do that. So for example, they weren't mental health activists or campaigners. So in terms of the feedback that we got from people, well, it was pretty powerful actually. And again, in the document, the main document, the Power Threat Meaning Overview, we quote extensively from our consultants, because there's always people's lived experiences and people speaking for themselves. The words are very powerful, really capture the impact that these things have had on people. So one person, this is participant E, said the most helpful aspect has been the power, and had this been up for discussion it would have changed the course of what had happened for me. So again, you know, these 3 themes that run throughout the document around power, around threat and around meaning, a number of people felt that making the operation of power explicit was crucial actually, and of course particularly when you think about within traditional mental health settings, people have statutory powers over people. So the issue of power is considerable on a number of levels, both the issues around power or abuses of power may have led people to end up in psychiatric settings in the first place, and then often what's being reenacted are further abuses of power. So another participant said the power part of the framework is the fulcrum of it for me. Again, very much that looking at power in these really multiple ways, you know, that power operates in our lives. Again, we refer to the work of people like David Smale, who's done extensive work on power operating at numerous levels, and how that impacts, and actually how threat responses are understandable reactions to abuses of power. For example, somebody else said it would have felt like a weight off my shoulders to feel that the person I was talking to was recognising the things that were predominantly the cause of my problems. Somebody hearing me say, I've absolutely had the sharp end of the stick in certain power-related situations, that would have been an incredibly helpful alternative to what happened, which again, knowing a little bit about this person, was in fact further reenactments of power and denials of reality, which, as I've said quoting Lucy Johnston, for me is one of the biggest abuses of power. Having the power and actually the audacity to redefine somebody else's reality, for me, is the grossest form of abuse. So what this framework is really trying to do is say, whatever your belief system, whatever meanings you ascribe to your experiences, that's our starting point.
Constantly throughout my life, in all different spheres, I existed. And another dramatic threat on the day I started to hear voices. My voices constantly threatening to harm and berating me as a justification for why they would harm me felt like an expression of the fear I'd spent my life denying I felt, and mirrored the general pattern of threats that I'd experienced. So again, as somebody who's done a lot of work with voice hearers, this very powerful link, the ways in which the threats that people have experienced are then re-experienced through the voices and made the echo on long after the original trauma. And again, why it's so important to attend to such experiences rather than as common practice is trying to just suppress them and ignore them, but actually they may have really important messages about what's happened to the person. So consultants spoke frequently about the damaging impact of having others' meanings imposed on their feelings and behaviour within mental health services. I mean, as Lucy has famously said in the past, to reframe somebody else's reality is the biggest abuse of power. And I quote that a lot because for me there is no greater abuse of power than to try and define someone else's reality for them. So there were lots that echoed with many of the consultants that we spoke to. Absolutely everything I had to say, including that the drugs were making things worse. Staff made me, and more specifically my brain, the problem rather than my traumatic experiences. So again, once you've been subject to that clinical gaze, any complaint or any issue that you have is kind of subsumed in your diagnosis rather than being a legitimate complaint about the impact of taking medication. Consultants saw the process of meaning making and permission to speak as being linked. So again, we were talking earlier about power and the ways in which people, Mary talked very eloquently about the ways in which people are silenced. But people felt that this offered an alternative and it was more appropriate and a much more appropriate intervention, and it allowed people to adopt more adaptive coping responses and feel more positive about themselves. So rather than being seen, typical language maladaptive coping strategy, to see something as an understandable response to threats. People felt that was a much more honouring kind of language. What did you do to survive? So what kinds of threats response are you currently using? Again, we got a phenomenal amount of detail back from the people that we spoke to. B stated that it was extremely useful to provide a context for consciously exploring and addressing one's responses to threats and what the origins of these might be. Dealing with real things that are happening right now rather than persuading you that you're a bit crazy, take the pill, shut up about it. Done some more general comments. Consultant A approved of the simplicity of the framework. It is simple yet clever at the same time, a bit like me. And how three discrete yet overlapping constructs could be used to capture many different strands of one's experience. So again, what we've done is really trying to sort of boil it down to these key principles around power, threat and meaning. So what sounds actually quite simple, as you can see, allows for a really rich kind of set of discussions about what might have happened to somebody. B felt the framework made an enormous amount of sense and was very strong and useful and really, really helpful, particularly the threat component actually. And again, once you have a chance to look through the whole document, you will see we've got an extensive list of threat responses, many of which, of course, traditionally are seen as symptoms of an illness to be medicated away rather than understandable reactions to being threatened. B also really approved of the way that the framework facilitated open discussion of unmentionable events, like childhood sexual abuse, for example, experiences of racial abuse and discrimination, things that are not made space for typically in mental health settings. And it could help people feel a sense of permission to disclose, that it's okay to talk about these things, it's okay to tell people about them, it's okay to name them. C felt that the framework made absolute sense and covered issues of huge relevance to the precipitation and maintenance of emotional distress. C particularly approved of the way that the framework encapsulates broader sociological issues and applies these in a way that contextualises individual psychological concerns. And C felt that this was a major step forward, as it is something that is obviously absent from current diagnostic categories and ICDs and DSMs, etc. So he also felt that the framework had implications in terms of things like social activism, so it moved away from this very individualistic approach and enabled people to start joining together to get involved in things like social activism and challenging the status quo, in the sense that it highlights the toxic impact of various forms of oppression and injustice. So as I'm often banging about, it makes the personal much more political, and we see ourselves much more not just as individuals, but we live in a social, economic and political context, which of course has a massive impact on our mental health. So to summarise strengths of the framework, people felt that in terms of preventing or making more difficult the imposition of others' meanings, that this allowed much more space for people to be able to create their own meanings, to give permission to speak about certain life experiences, encourage more positive and helpful coping responses. So, for example, rather than just medicating different responses away, although, just to be clear, we're not anti-medication, because sometimes medication can be really helpful for people. Of course, the problem is that it's often the only thing that people are offered. Which can be a disempowering experience. So this allowed for the possibility to explore other kinds of coping, as well as using things like meds. And somebody said that if the framework had been offered at first contact with services, I can guess I would have felt stronger afterwards to be able to see a professional, ask me genuinely about any problems I'd had, power-related situations or threat situations, and telling me these are absolutely valid things to be hugely unhappy about and very valid things to have suffered because of it. Making what you're experiencing make sense, which of course is what we all want to feel, that we make sense to other people. In terms of improving or queries around the framework, many legitimate feedback. Some people raise the issue around language and conceptual complexity, and consequently how accessible that might make it for some people. People actually had ideas about additional threat responses that we could add. People raised the issue about the danger of imposing yet another professional model, but just to reiterate, this is not a model, it's a framework, and it's something we're offering for people to use in any which way they want, or to not use if they don't feel that it's relevant to them. So we're certainly not trying to impose another psychological framework. And other people talked about the need for wider cultural change if the framework is to have an impact. Another consultant also pointed out that the framework might be problematic for people who might prefer a diagnosis, which of course there are many people that do, as somebody's already mentioned, because that enables people to not explore their personal history and to seem to provide clear-cut answers rather than this much more complex picture, which of course this framework would inevitably provide. So it's a very quick summary. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to hand straight over to John Reid.
I wanted you 5 extra minutes.
All right, have you?
I'm generous that way.
Apparently I've been granted 5 extra minutes. Or 3. Oh, right.
So,
yes, Your Highness. Power, threat, meaning. Right, okay. So, possible uses of the framework for service users, survivors, for all of us. So, in terms of guided discussions for personal or peer-supported use, So actually you could just use the framework again to riff off, much in the same way that the diagram that I showed, that it's not a rigid framework or tool that has to be used in a kind of systematic way. People can apply it in ways that make most sense to them. In terms of group support, in and out of services with the aims of information sharing, validating, creating new narratives, offering alternatives, promoting social action, making links with wider issues of social justice and equality. And this really important issue that John mentioned earlier about restoring epistemic injustice, experienced by groups who lack shared social resources to make sense of their experiences due to unequal power relationships. And of course, as I've said many times, in my view, people that are subject to psychiatric diagnoses are the most vulnerable members of our society. And I would say that the fighting for the rights of people who've been labelled mentally ill is actually the last great civil rights movement. And I think this framework offers a possibility of joining together as survivors and activists and saying, actually, we're not happy with things as they are, and we really need to shake up the status quo.
Hi. I will talk for 3.5 minutes about stigma and how, just as excluding the expert by experience from proper consideration and full placing it at the centre for services is a ridiculous concept. It's also a ridiculous concept when it comes to how to talk to the public about these issues and how to reduce stigma. And this is just a summary of what the research tells us diagnostic labels do. If we teach and go out of your way to teach the public to learn how to use diagnoses and be sophisticated like mental health professionals, this is the result. It increases perceived dangerousness, perceived unpredictability, perceived lack of responsibility for our own actions, lack of humanity, perceived severity of the problem, perceived dependency, pessimism about recovery, fear, rejection, desire for distance. And underlying all of that, the mediating variable really there is that diagnostic labels increase people's belief in biogenetic causes. So if you can convince people that there is a chemical imbalance or there's something inferior about people's genes, surprise, surprise, they're going to think they're not going to recover. They're going to think they're a different species than us. It increases that perception of differences. How could it be otherwise? So it's not a surprise, however, when drug companies are willing to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on these so-called destigmatisation programs to teach us that mental illness is an illness like any other. I don't know why the drug companies would want to do that. So if we really wanted to get rid of stigma, we would do these two very simple things. Abandon biogenetic explanations and diagnostic labels, and increase contact with the people involved and understanding of their life circumstances, which is how you would decrease stigma for any in-group, out-group. Social psychology has known that for 40 years. Only in the field of mental health have we forgotten that. Just as in so many things, we are not evidence-based. So currently we have a non-evidence-based approach to destigmatisation, which is making things worse. And the sort of framework that we're talking about today needs to be applied to public education just as much as it does to services. That leaves me 90 seconds to talk about two other things. Dave talked about the issues involved in how do we conduct research, outcome research, without diagnostic categories, and the answer is extraordinarily simply and much easier than diagnostic labels. So we're about to publish the largest ever survey of people who have been on antipsychotics, 800 people from 30 countries. We didn't care about their diagnosis, and only about 30% of people had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, because antipsychotics are used all over the place now. Old people's homes, prisons, younger people. So it's a red herring. It locks us into the wrong pathway if we go with diagnostic labels. We asked a sophisticated question: did this drug help you with the problems for which it was prescribed? Yes, no, don't know. Really sophisticated. Yes, 40, let me get this right. Yes, 44%, no, 42%. Close. But then we asked the follow-up question: did it increase your quality of life? Or did it make it worse? made it better 27%, made it worse 52%. That's what happens when you ask straightforward, simplistic questions. My last 30 seconds is to deal with the fact that some people inside the movement, and critiquing the movement, because I think we are a movement actually, are describing all this approach as radical. So I just want to disespouse us. Is there a word, disespouse? There is now. Disespouse.
That's a good one.
Read J 2018 disespouse. To get rid of this idea. In 1952, which was a very good year, some excellent people were born that year. The first DSM, and they didn't know it was the first, they thought it was the only DSM, which was about 20 pages long, came out. And it talked about depressive reactions, psychotic reactions, anxiety-based reactions. So all we're doing is going really back in a more sophisticated way to 1952. There's nothing radical about this. We lost that when the biological lot took over the American Psychiatric Association from the psychoanalysts. And the very last point is that if you feel that this is an uphill battle, the public are ahead of us. What I mean by that is the survey's been done in 24 countries now about what the average punter, what the public thinks causes mental health problems. There's only one country that gets it wrong. It's the same country that gets everything wrong. They can't help themselves, so we'll just put them over there. All 23 other countries said it's psychosocial, it's poverty, it's loneliness, it's stress at work, it's stress at home, it's child abuse, it's child neglect. So our job, this is not a radical program, a radical framework at all. It's trying to get us to catch up with the public and meet their expectations of us. So when they come into mental health services, people ask them what's going on in their lives. It's as simple as that. There's nothing radical about it. Thanks a lot.